The archaeologist's fine-bristled brush whispers across a surface of cool, compacted earth, revealing something smooth within the shadowed ruins of a palace. Centuries of dust fall away, and a pair of wide, dark eyes stare up into the bright Cretan sunlight for the first time in over 3 millennia. It is a small figure, crafted from faience, its pale green glaze still luminous, its skirt flounced in delicate tears. In each of her raised hands, she grips the head and tail of a spotted serpent, her expression one of absolute, untroubled command. This is the goddess, or perhaps the priestess, unearthed from the rubble of Knossos, an icon of a civilization that possessed a serene, startlingly modern grace. She is the central mystery, the silent emissary of a people who built vast, unfortified palaces, painted their walls with leaping dolphins, and then vanished into the silence of the sea. To understand her power, to know the world that dreamed her into being, we must drift far back, beyond the labyrinth, beyond the throne room, to a time before the first great stone was ever quarried. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Our journey begins in a much deeper quiet, long before the snake goddess was shaped and fired, before any palace held a court. We must travel back 9,000 years, to the dim light of the Neolithic dawn, when the island of Crete was merely a long, rugged spine of limestone and schist rising from the deep indigo of the Mediterranean. It was an island of silent mountains and deep gorges, covered in ancient forests of cypress and pine, its shores untouched save for the slow work of the waves. It waited in the vast emptiness of the sea, a sanctuary of wild goats and birds, holding its breath for the first human footfall. They came, not as conquerors, but as pioneers, drifting across the unpredictable expanse of the Libyan Sea from the south, or perhaps island hopping from the east, from the shores of Anatolia. Their vessels were not the sleek, painted ships of later frescoes, but were likely humble, hollowed-out log canoes or rafts of bound reeds, fragile craft propelled by paddle and current, carrying the essential seeds of a new life. These first settlers, perhaps only a few dozen souls, carried with them the very blueprint of the Neolithic Revolution: sacks of emmer wheat and barley, lentils, and peas. They also brought the first domesticated animals to the island, the goat and the sheep, whose descendants would forever graze the sharp hillsides, and the pig. They made landfall not on a gentle, welcoming beach, but likely in a sheltered cove, pulling their worn vessels onto the shingle, the scent of wild sage and thyme crushed underfoot, filling the air. They faced a land that was both generous and severe, a place of scarce fresh water in the long, dry summers, yet possessed of fertile hidden plains, and most importantly, countless caves. These dark, limestone voids became their first homes, the womb-like shelters at places like Miamu or Girani, offering coolness from the relentless sun and protection from the chilling night winds that swept down from the peaks of Idas and Dicte. Inside these deep recesses, the first human chapter of Crete was written. The sounds of this world were the steady drip of water percolating through the rock, the crackle of a newly kindled hearth, and the rhythmic, abrasive scrape of stone on stone. Life centered on the fire, a precious spark of orange light that held the immense pressing darkness at bay, its smoke slowly blackening the high vaulted ceilings. Here, they worked the obsidian they would soon trade for, a sharp volcanic glass from the island of Melos, chipping it into precise blades for cutting reeds and hide. Here, they tended their small flocks, and perhaps most importantly, they began to shape the island's earth with their hands. They created the first pottery, simple dark burnished vessels, undecorated and functional, built not on a fast spinning wheel, but coiled slowly by hand and fired in open pits. These pots held water, stored grain, and simmered the first meals cooked on Cretan soil, humble artifacts that nonetheless anchored these people to their new home. Outside the caves, they began the slow, arduous work of clearing the land. Their polished stone axes, hafted to wooden handles, bit into the scrub oak and maquis, opening small patches of the island's characteristic terra rossa, the heavy, iron-rich red earth. They learned the rhythm of this soil, its deep crimson color, a sign of its fertility. They learned to read the seasons, the mild, wet winters that swelled the grain, and the long, arid summers that baked the clay hard. They sowed their wheat and barley, trusting the earth, and in time, the earth provided. This was the first agriculture on the island, the beginning of a relationship with the land that would define its people for millennia, a cycle of planting and harvest that would eventually generate the vast surpluses needed to build the palaces we remember. They were not yet Minoans, but they were the rootstock, the deep, patient foundation. These communities were small, isolated pockets of human activity in a vast wilderness. Some remained in the caves, while others built small, permanent villages, clusters of simple rectangular houses with stone foundations and walls of sun-dried mud brick. One such settlement was established on a low, gentle hill near the coast, a place chosen for its good soil and reliable water source. It was an unremarkable spot, yet it was here, at Knossos, that the Neolithic farmers built their huts, lived, died, and buried their dead, often beneath the very floors of their homes. Generation after generation, they lived on this same hill, their lives unfolding slowly, their refuse and the debris of their simple homes gradually raising the height of the mound. They had no sense of the future, no vision of the labyrinthine structure that would one day rise directly atop the foundations of their own small world. They were simply living, learning the subtle language of the island, their bones mingling with the red earth, becoming the first layer of a story that was just beginning, the first stone laid in silence. The deep, resonant quiet of the Neolithic world, punctuated only by the chipping of stone and the crackle of the hearth, did not last forever. Time does not permit such stillness. Across the island, the small farming hamlets nestled in the red earth began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the gradual shift in the light that marks the end of a long, slow afternoon. Centuries bled into millennia, and the deep layers of Neolithic settlement at Knossos grew thicker, the mound rising foot by foot. But elsewhere, a new energy was stirring, a faint vibration carried on the wind and across the water. It was a change that began not with stone, but with something new, something wrested from the rock itself, something that held the light differently. This was the dawn of the early Minoan period, the first true glimmer of the Bronze Age, an era that would be defined by the sea, by growing communities, and by the whispers of a new, transformative power: copper. This new knowledge did not arrive in a flash, but rather as a guarded secret, a traded novelty. Perhaps a sailor from the Cyclades or the coast of Anatolia brought the first object ashore, a small, greenish, unassuming dagger blade, or a simple awl. It was heavier than stone, yet it could be sharpened to a finer edge, and when broken, it did not shatter, but could be melted down and reborn in the fire. This was its magic, malleability. The island of Crete itself possessed deposits of copper hidden in the mountain ranges, and the islanders, now intimately familiar with their rocky home, began to find them. They learned the arduous process of smelting, of building fires hot enough in simple clay-lined pit furnaces, urged on by blowpipes or skin bellows, to coax the vibrant metal from its dull, earthy ore. The air in these new settlements, like the one that would rise at Vasiliki in the east, began to fill with a new, acrid scent, the sharp tang of burning charcoal and molten metal. The mastery of copper, and soon bronze, its stronger alloy, achieved by adding the even rarer resource of tin, which had to be imported from impossibly distant lands, fundamentally altered the island's relationship with the outside world. Stone and clay were local, but metal was global, or at least Aegean-wide. To acquire tin, to trade their own surplus of timber, wool, and perhaps the first fragrant jars of olive oil, the Cretans had to truly master the sea. The humble dugout canoes of their ancestors gave way to more sophisticated vessels. Longboats, propelled by rows of paddlers, their forms captured in primitive clay models, began to ply the waters, venturing north into the scattered, sun-bleached islands of the Cyclades. They were no longer just pioneers. They were becoming mariners, learning the subtle tempers of the Meltemi wind, reading the star paths from one island landmark to the next. The sea, once a barrier, was becoming a bridge, a great flowing road of deep blue water. This new outward focus brought with it new wealth, new ideas, and a visible change in the structure of life. The small, scattered farming hamlets began to coalesce into larger, more organized towns. At Myrtos, on the southern coast overlooking the Libyan Sea, a dense warren of small, interconnected rooms grew up a hillside, a communal structure that speaks of a collective, cooperative life, its walls of red mud brick built upon a stone foundation. Further east, at Vasiliki, a peculiar, mottled red and black pottery appeared, its surface burnished to a high sheen, the result of a deliberate, complex firing process. The shapes of these new vessels were inventive, spouted jugs and long-beaked pitchers that seem almost alive, imitating the gourds of the natural world. These were not the simple, functional bowls of the Neolithic caves. These were objects of intention, of burgeoning style, meant to pour wine or oil in a home that was growing more complex. The metal itself, the catalyst for this change, was still precious. We find it first not in weapons of war, for this era seems remarkably peaceful, but in tools and symbols of status, small triangular daggers, perhaps used for ritual or as personal items of prestige. Simple, sturdy axes for clearing the cypress forests, their bronze edges holding true, far longer than stone. And for the first time, we see the glint of personal adornment. Goldsmiths, perhaps the same artisans who worked the copper, learned to hammer native gold, traded from Egypt or the East, into thin, delicate bands and simple coiled beads. These objects, found in the era's simple tombs, small circular tholos structures, or rectangular ossuaries where communities laid their dead to rest together, were the first whispers of individual wealth, the first time a person carried their station with them into the earth. Life, however, remained rooted in the soil. The great surpluses of olive oil and wheat, the wool from the island's countless sheep, these were the true currency. The metal was simply the agent of change, the tool that sharpened the axe, the luxury that paid for the import, the gleam that decorated the wrist. But its arrival had set something in motion, a current that could not be reversed. The island was awakening. Its small communities, perched on coastal hillsides, were now looking outward, their faces turned toward the sea, their hands learning to shape fire-born metal. The rhythms of the Neolithic were fading, replaced by the clang of the smith's hammer and the steady sound of oars dipping into the wine-dark water, pulling the island, stroke by stroke, toward the wide, interconnected world of the Bronze Age, toward the paths of obsidian and the rise of the palaces yet to come. Long before the first bronze dagger gleamed, and before the potter's wheel found its true speed, the most vital cutting edge of the burgeoning Minoan world was not metal, but stone. It was not the pale, serviceable chert quarried from Crete's own limestone hills. It was a foreign material, a glass born of volcanic fire, dark as a starless night and capable of holding an edge sharper than any material then known, sharper even than modern surgical steel. This was obsidian, and it did not belong to Crete. Its presence in the island's earliest settlements, from the Neolithic caves to the early Minoan towns, tells the story of the first true maritime enterprise, the tracing of a path across the open sea that would become the artery for all future commerce and connection. This was the obsidian path, the first thread that stitched the island to the wider, waiting world, a dark, glittering line drawn across the blue expanse of the Aegean. The source was a specific, starkly beautiful island to the north, a place of bleached white cliffs and sulphurous hot springs, Melos. Part of the island chain known as the Cyclades, Melos was a scarred, volcanic remnant, a place where the Earth's inner fire had breached the sea. Its quarries at Adamas and Menegaki were the epicenters of this Stone Age trade, the places where this black glass lay in vast, accessible deposits. For the early Cretans, this material was a revelation. When struck with precision, it flaked in a predictable conchoidal fracture, producing long, leaf-shaped blades of almost supernatural thinness and sharpness. A piece of obsidian was a piece of solidified, captured power, a tool that transformed the daily acts of cutting, scraping, and carving. It was worth the journey. It was worth the risk. And so they set out. We must imagine the scene on a Cretan shore, perhaps at an early harbor settlement, like Moklos in the east. The vessel is not a grand, sail-powered ship, but a longboat, a high-prowed canoe built from the island's tall cypress trees, its planks perhaps stitched together with sinew. It holds 30, maybe 40 paddlers, their bare shoulders set for the long, rhythmic work ahead. They carry with them the island's surplus, heavy woolen textiles, dyed perhaps with murex purple or plant-based reds, clay jars of the island's prized new olive oil, and sacks of barley. They are venturing into the open sea, an act of profound faith and navigational skill. They leave the familiar sight of Crete's snow-capped mountains behind, a long purple smudge on the southern horizon, a name for the first small hazy islands to the north, hopping from one visible speck of land to the next in the great Cycladic chain. The journey itself was a sensory immersion. The sun beat down, the salt spray dried white on their skin and on the dark wood of the hull. The sound was the steady, percussive thump splash of the paddles hitting the water in unison, a human heartbeat set against the immense, sighing backdrop of the sea. They were navigators reading the world, watching the flight of gulls, the pattern of the swells, and at night, the slow, cold wheeling of the northern stars. When they finally reached Melos, they would have pulled their boat onto a beach of black sand, the air smelling of sulfur, the white cliffs blinding in the sun. The trade was one of barter, a silent or negotiated exchange of Cretan bounty for heavy cores of the precious black glass. The Minoans were not raiders, they were traders. This path was one of reciprocal need, not conquest. Back on Crete, the obsidian was a catalyst. In the hands of a skilled napper, a single core could be meticulously worked to produce dozens of blades. These were the tools that harvested the wheat, that scraped the fat from sheep hides, that carved the first intricate seals from softer stone, and that perhaps performed the first ritual incisions. To hold one of these blades is to feel its cold, alien smoothness. It is a fragment of another island, a piece of pure geological time. But the path brought more than just the stone itself. The paddlers who returned to Crete did not just carry obsidian, they carried memories. They carried the look of Cycladic pottery, the designs on their own simple, elegant marble figurines, and the knowledge of different building styles. They brought back the idea of the world beyond the horizon. This trade route, this obsidian path, was the island's first great lesson in interconnectedness. It established a rhythm of departure and return, a flow of goods and concepts that began to weave the Minoan settlements into a complex, interdependent Aegean tapestry. The sea was no longer a void separating lands, but a web of pathways, a surface upon which a civilization could write its ambitions. The other islands of the Cyclades, Naxos, Paros, Amorgos, became familiar ports of call, each a node in a network that was slowly gaining complexity, like a spider's web glistening in the dawn. Its first anchoring thread spun from dark, volcanic glass. The world was shrinking, and Crete, with its harbors and its growing confidence on the water, was becoming its center. A future still held dormant within the glassy, dark reflection of the Melian stone. The ships that plied the obsidian path and returned with copper ingots were not just vessels of cargo. They were vessels of complexity. As the early Minoan towns grew larger, as the communal tombs filled, and as the great pathoi jars in the storerooms multiplied, a new human problem emerged from the abundance, the challenge of memory, ownership, and trust. How could one mark a jar of oil as belonging to a specific family? How could a storeroom door be sealed to ensure its contents remained untouched? How could a shipment of wool be accounted for? The answer, long before the first line of script was ever drawn, came in the form of a small, intensely personal, and beautiful object, the stone seal. This was the first true whisper of administration, a sign of identity pressed into soft clay, a system of control that predated the very concept of a palace. This innovation began humbly, with simple materials found close at hand. The first seals were carved from soft, local steatite, or soapstone, its greenish-gray surface yielding easily to a sharp flint or obsidian blade. They were also carved from bone, or the precious imported hippopotamus ivory that began to arrive from Egypt, a sign of the expanding trade routes. These early seals were not the flat stamps we might imagine, but were often conical, pyramidal, or zoomorphic, carved into the shape of an animal, a bird, a recumbent sheep, or perhaps a monkey, its tiny form curled into a resting position. The carving itself was the key. On the flat base of the seal, the artisan would engrave a pattern, a unique, identifying mark. These were not letters, but potent symbols, interlocking spirals that mimicked the motion of the sea, intricate cross-hatchings, stylized representations of ships with their high prows, or the branching patterns of leaves. To use the seal was an act of quiet authority. A lump of wet, pliable clay, that same red earth of the island, would be pressed over the stopper of a jar, the knot on a bale of goods, or the lock of a wooden chest. Then the owner would press their seal firmly into the clay. As the clay dried, it became a hard, brittle guardian, bearing the unique impress of its owner. To break it was to commit a public, visible transgression. These sealings, the discarded fragments of clay, are found by archaeologists in the thousands, a brittle, bureaucratic dust that tells a story of a society organizing itself. We can feel the coolness of the stone in the palm, the slight, damp resistance of the clay, and the satisfying pressure that leaves a mark, a single, clear thought. This is mine. As the centuries of the early Minoan period flowed toward the middle Minoan, and as the foundations of the first palaces were being conceptualized, these seals became masterpieces of miniature art. The artisans, now masters of their craft, moved to harder, more beautiful stones, amethyst, carnelian, jasper, and rock crystal. The imagery exploded in complexity. Lions, captured in mid-leap, griffins with eagle heads and lion bodies, spiders weaving their webs, and intricate architectural motifs. These were no longer just functional marks. They were amulets, badges of office, and expressions of a sophisticated visual language. They were worn on the body, perhaps on a leather thong around the wrist or neck, a constant tangible connection to one's own power and place in the growing social order. But the seals were not the only innovation. In the same workshops where these miniature sculptures were being born, another, more linear idea was taking shape. Scribes, or perhaps the seal makers themselves, began to incise symbols onto small clay bars and tablets. This was not yet the flowing script of linear A, but something more primal, more pictorial, Cretan hieroglyphics. Each sign was a recognizable, if simplified, image from the world. A human leg to mean go or walk, a spouted jug to mean wine or oil, a ship, a saffron flower, a double axe. It was a true script, though one we still cannot read, a collection of perhaps 100 signs, used not for poetry, but for lists. It was the language of the storeroom, the harbor, and the shrine. The most famous of these early pictographic documents is not a list, but a disc found in the southern palace of Phaistos. It is a flat, circular piece of fired clay, a little larger than a human hand, and it is unique. Spiraling from the outside in, on both faces, is a line of these hieroglyphs, not carved, but stamped into the wet clay with individual punches, like a form of primitive movable type. We see a plumed head, a running man, a fish, a shield, a beehive. The meaning is lost, perhaps a hymn, a ritual incantation, or a legal proclamation, its spiral path a labyrinth of lost language. It is a perfect enigma, a message from this pre-palatial world that seems to hold all its mystery in its coiled, silent form. These two streams of information, the personal, image-based authority of the seal and the administrative, symbolic language of the hieroglyphs, were the intellectual scaffolding upon which the great palaces could be built. They were the tools that allowed a central authority to track, gather, and redistribute the island's immense wealth. Before the first great court was paved, before the first fresco was painted, the Minoan mind had already learned to abstract the world, to capture life in a carved stone and a mark on clay. The ground was being prepared, not just with shovels and stone hammers, to build a physical structure, but with these small, potent signs, which were building the very idea of a complex, centralized civilization. The power to record, to claim, and to account, now captured in the hard glitter of a carnelian seal and the systematic markings on a clay tablet, was an abstract, intellectual force. But such a force cannot remain immaterial for long. It demands a physical center, a place where the grain and oil counted in the ledgers can be gathered and stored, a place where the authority impressed in the clay can be given a human face and a tangible home. The scattered hilltop towns and communal ossuaries of the early Minoan age, with their shared egalitarian rhythm, were no longer sufficient for the complexity that had been unleashed. The island's energy, which had been gathering for 1,000 years, now required a focal point, a single, monumental stage, and it found one on a low, unassuming hill that had already seen millennia of human life, the gentle rise at Knossos. This hill was not a dramatic, fortified acropolis, not a sheer cliff chosen for defense. It was a soft-shouldered rise of earth, situated a few strategic miles inland from the sea, safe from the sudden, stinging raids of pirates, yet close enough for its inhabitants to see the white sails of their own merchant ships moving in the harbor of Knossos. It was cradled by the small, seasonal Kairos River, which provided fresh water, and it presided over a wide, fertile valley, its red earth perfect for the olive groves and barley fields that were the true source of the island's wealth. For thousands of years, this mound had been the site of a sprawling Neolithic village, the accumulated debris of countless generations of farmers. Now, around 1900 BCE, that ancient history was deliberately, definitively paved over. The small, mud brick huts were razed, the ground was leveled, and a project of almost unimaginable scale and single-minded vision began. The very first thing they built, the element that would define the entire structure, and in turn, an entire civilization, was not a wall, nor a tower, nor a throne room. It was a void. They laid the foundations for the great central court, a massive paved rectangle of staggering proportions, roughly 50 meters long and 25 wide. This was not an afterthought, not a garden tucked inside a fortress. It was the generative, organizing principle of the entire palace. Its long axis was oriented with remarkable precision, running almost perfectly north-south, an alignment that perhaps followed the sacred peaks visible on the horizon, the horns of Mount Juctus to the south, or tracked the celestial movements of the sun and stars. This vast, open-air floor became the anchor for the entire Minoan world, the first fixed point in their cultural universe. Once this great, flat stage was established, the palace began to grow around it, not on it. It was an architecture of introversion, with the buildings turning their backs to the outside world and opening their facades inward toward the light and activity of the court. A warren of rooms began to rise, built from massive, rough-hewn limestone blocks for the foundations and sturdy, sun-dried mud brick for the upper walls. The sounds of construction must have filled the valley for decades, the percussive clink of stone hammers dressing the blocks, the grating rasp of large saws cutting through the immense cypress trunks that would become the first columns and ceiling beams, the chatter of hundreds of laborers. From the court, grand staircases began to ascend, and long corridors began to tunnel into the growing complex, but they all drew their light and their logic from the central expanse. This court was the communal heart, the island's primary artery. We must imagine it not as an empty, windswept museum piece, but as a space dense with human life. In the cool of the morning, it would have been a marketplace, the paved stones crowded with merchants, the air filled with the scent of dried herbs, fresh wool, and pottery. Scribes with their clay tablets would move through the throng, counting, recording, directing goods into the labyrinthine couloirs, the deep, stone-lined pits sunk into the court's western edge, built to store the state's surplus of grain. Then, as the sun climbed high, the court might be cleared for ritual. Perhaps a procession of priests and priestesses, dressed in their flounced skirts and elaborate headdresses, would move slowly from the southern entrance toward the shrines, the sunlight flashing from their golden ornaments. It was here, in this shared space, that the civilization was oriented. Power was not, it seems, sequestered in a remote throne room, gazing down on the people. Instead, it was met within this communal area. The western wing, rising directly from the court, housed the shrines and the state's most important chambers, their facades presenting a grand, unified front. The eastern wing held the workshops, the clanging of the bronzesmiths and the meticulous work of the potters echoing across the pavement. This court unified the sacred and the profane, the administrative and the artisanal, the state and the individual. It was a space that simultaneously gathered and redistributed, a breathing lung for the new palatial organism. As the first old palaces took shape on this gentle hill, this central void remained its single, most important feature, the silent, sun-drenched space that gave a scattered people a common ground and a shared horizon. The energy that leveled the hill at Knossos and laid its vast central court was not a solitary phenomenon, not a singular pulse of ambition confined to the island's north. The idea was too potent to be contained. We must let our gaze drift southward, pulling back from the Kairotis Valley, rising high over the rugged, snow-capped spine of Mount Ida, the mythical birthplace of a god yet to be named. From this silent, wind-scoured altitude, the island unrolls below us, a long, wrinkled map of limestone and olive-gray scrub. To the south, beyond the jagged peaks, the land softens and falls away into a vast, sun-drenched expanse, the largest and most fertile basin on Crete, the Masara Plain. This plain, a wide, flat river of red earth pressed between the mountains and the distant shimmering line of the Libyan Sea, was the island's granary, its true, inexhaustible source of wealth. Here, in the shimmering, often oppressive heat of the south, The rhythm of life was dictated by the barley and the wheat. The land was wide, open, and immensely productive, and any power that wished to rule this half of the island had to command this plain. Upon a strategic, isolated hill at the plain's western edge, a hill that rises like a ship's prow from the sea of grain, another great project began, almost in perfect synchrony with the work at Knossos. This was Phaistos. It was not a colony of the north, not a provincial outpost, but a parallel emergence, a second heart for the Minoan civilization, a rival palace in its own right, gazing south toward Egypt and Africa, while Knossos looked north to the Aegean. The same impulse, the same administrative need, and the same architectural grammar were at work, the island developing two powerful, competing, and perhaps cooperative centers of gravity. Like Knossos, the palace at Phaistos was organized around its own magnificent paved central court, a vast rectangle of stone aligned on that same sacred north-south axis. This court, too, was the project's genesis, the void around which the labyrinth would grow. But Phaistos had its own distinct dramatic character, one dictated by its topography. The hill was steeper, and the architects used this to their advantage, creating a theatricality that Knossos lacked. To approach the main entrance, one ascended a monumental flight of steps, a grand staircase 12 meters wide, its shallow limestone treads polished by millennia of footsteps and sun. This staircase was an act of public architecture, a formal processional way that led visitors up from the lower courts, past the deep, stone-lined couloirs pits, the public granaries, even larger than those at Knossos, sunk directly into the earth and delivered them into the grandeur of the state apartments. The western wing of Phaistos, pressing against the central court, was a masterpiece of old palace architecture. It was a dense, complex arrangement of rooms, but its facade onto the court was unified and imposing, a long, careful wall of ashlar blocks. Within this wing, benches lined the walls of anterooms, awaiting petitioners or participants in rituals. Light wells, a brilliant Minoan invention, pierced the deep structure, drawing the intense Mediterranean sun down into the lower floors, illuminating painted plaster walls and the dark, polished wood of the cypress columns. It was in this wing that the scribes worked, their hands dusty with clay, their styluses moving quickly to record the endless flow of commodities from the plain. It was here, in these very rooms, buried deep in a collapsed stratum of the old palace, that the enigmatic Phaistos disk, with its spiral of stamped, unread hieroglyphs, would one day be found, a perfect testament to this southern center's unique intellectual and religious life. The workshops at Phaistos were equally renowned, their kilns firing pottery of an astonishing delicacy and vibrant imagination. The potters here, funded by the immense wealth of the Massara, were pushing the boundaries of their craft, developing new techniques to create vessels with walls as thin as eggshells, their dark surfaces decorated with swirling abstract motifs in brilliant white and vermilion red, a style that would soon captivate the entire Aegean. The sound of the fast spinning wheel, the sharp scent of the levigated clay, and the heat from the kilns would have drifted across the courts, a constant reminder of the palace's role as a center of production, not just consumption. The vast magazines, the storerooms, were filled with the results. Gigantic pithoi jars, taller than a man, lining the cool, dark corridors, their clay bodies impressed with the seals of the palace authority, full to the brim with oil, wine, and barley. Phaistos was a statement of power, but like Knossos, it was a power that seemed to open itself to the landscape rather than shrink from it. From the upper verandas of the palace, the view was overwhelming. One could survey the entire plain, a patchwork of green and gold, stretching eastward, and to the south, the deep, unchanging blue of the Libyan Sea, the gateway to the ancient, powerful civilizations of Egypt and the Levant. This was the view of the palace's masters, a daily affirmation of their control over the island's breadbasket and the maritime routes that fed their ambition. The palace was a nexus of grain, clay, and administration, a proud southern sibling to Knossos, its grand staircase rising from the red earth, an echo in stone of the same complex idea, a mirror reflecting the same nascent, brilliant light. In the new, bustling warrens of the old palaces, in the workshops that opened onto the eastern side of the great courts, at Knossos and Phaistos, the air was filled with a constant, humming sound. It was a new sound, a technological heartbeat that set the pace for an entire industry. This was the rapid, steady whir of the fast-spinning potter's wheel, the slow, patient, hand-coiling method of the Neolithic and early Minoan ages, which built pots layer by layer, was being relegated to the creation of the giant pithoi storage jars. For finer, more delicate work, the wheel was now supreme. This tool, simple in concept but revolutionary in practice, was an extension of the potter's own will, allowing for a speed, a symmetry, and a breathtaking thinness that the human hand alone could never achieve. It was on this spinning disk of wood or clay that the Minoan artisan, with a wet, steady hand, would give birth to one of the most exquisite expressions of the island's spirit, the ceramic known as Camara's ware. This was pottery that seemed to defy its own material, its substance. The clay, sourced from the best beds on the island, was levigated to an incredible fineness, all impurities strained and settled out, leaving a paste as smooth as silk. On the speeding wheel, the potter's hands would rise, drawing this clay upward in a single fluid gesture, pulling the walls of a cup or a jug so thin that they became translucent, earning the name eggshell ware. To hold one of these cups, as the palace elite surely did, was to hold something that felt impossibly light, a captured bubble of fired earth, its fragility a testament to the artisan's absolute, confident mastery. The shapes themselves were inventive, elegant, and sophisticated, designed for a new, more refined way of life. Delicate, handleless teacups, tall-stemmed chalices, and the distinctive bridge-spouted jars, their spouts arching gracefully over the rim, allowing a liquid to be poured without a single drip. But the true magic, the feature that arrests the eye 3.5 millennia later, is the decoration. This was a polychrome art, a vibrant explosion of color. The potters first developed a rich, lustrous slip, a liquid clay solution that when fired in a complex oxygen-controlled kiln would turn a deep, velvety, almost bottomless black, as dark as the obsidian of Melos. This dark, shimmering surface became the canvas. Upon this night, the painters, perhaps women with fine, steady hands, applied their designs in brilliant, mineral-based pigments, a stark, chalky white, and a vivid, iron-rich vermilion red. Touches of yellow and orange were sometimes added, creating a palette that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The designs themselves were a perfect marriage of form and motion. They were not static, not repetitive geometric bands. Instead, they were dynamic, swirling, and alive, as if the energy of the spinning wheel had been permanently captured in the paint. Great, flowing spirals unwound across the curved bellies of the jars, interlocking and dissolving into one another. Rosettes bloomed, their petals spinning like pinwheels. Abstract, curvilinear patterns, derived perhaps from the veining of stone or the foam of a wave, danced in perfect harmony with the vessel's shape. Even natural elements, a blade of grass, a palm frond, a cluster of petals, were abstracted, stylized, and set in motion, integrated into a unified, rotating design that encourages the viewer to turn the pot in their hands, to follow the lines as they flow without beginning or end. This pottery, which we call kamaris, were after the sacred cave sanctuary on the slopes of Mount Ida, where it was first discovered in great quantities, was the signature art of the Old Palace period. It was not a folk art, but a high-status, centralized industry, its creation funded and directed by the administrative centers of Phaistos and Knossos. It was an aesthetic of pure, joyful energy, a celebration of motion and color that seems entirely free from the shadows of war or rigid dogma. It was also one of Crete's most successful exports. These delicate, precious vessels, filled with the island's fragrant oil or perhaps traded for their own intrinsic beauty, traveled the sea lanes. They have been found deep within the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs and in the palaces of the Levant, a vibrant, unmistakable calling card of Minoan taste and technical brilliance. They were the spinning, painted world of the first palaces, a culture captured in clay, its dynamic spirit fired to a permanent, elegant stillness. In the deep, quiet chambers of the western wings, away from the sun and sound of the central courts, a different kind of work was underway, a task as vital as the potters and as crucial as the smiths. Here in the archive rooms, the air was still and cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and drying clay. This was the intellectual heart of the palace, the administrative engine that drove the entire complex organism. The thrum of the potter's wheel and the clang of the hammer were the sounds of production, but the silence of these rooms was the sound of control, and in this silence, the human hand was mastering a new and potent technology, an elegant, efficient, and flowing series of marks that would become the true secret language of power, Linear A. The older pictographic script, the hieroglyphs of the Phaistos disk, and the early seals was a language of images. It was beautiful and symbolic, but it was slow, its signs complex and time-consuming to carve. As the old palaces at Knossos and Phaistos grew, as the trade routes expanded and the storerooms filled with the bewildering surplus of goods, this pictorial system was no longer enough. The palace administration, now managing an economy of continental scale, needed speed, it needed efficiency, and so, from the pictographs, a new script was born, abstracted and streamlined, its symbols shed of their visual baggage, reduced to their essential, linear forms. This was a script for scribes, for the quick hand, not the patient carver. We must picture the scribe at work. He, or perhaps she, sits on a low stool, a basket of wet, pre-formed clay tablets at their side. The tablets are small, often no bigger than the palm of a hand, rectangular and pillow-shaped, their surfaces smoothed by a damp cloth. The clay is cool to the touch, responsive. In their other hand, the scribe holds a stylus, a piece of sharpened reed, or a fine bronze point. Then the hand begins to move, not painting, not carving, but incising, or pressing the sharp point into the soft, receptive clay with a rapid, confident rhythm. The marks they leave are a combination of clean, straight lines, graceful curves, and simple dots, a script that flows across the tablet in neat, orderly rows, guided by faint, ruled lines. This is linear A. It is a thing of profound, functional beauty, a syllabary of perhaps 90 distinct signs, each one representing not a thing but a sound. Pa, da, re, mi. It is a true written language, capable of capturing the phonetics of a spoken tongue. Alongside these syllabic signs, the scribes employed a host of clear, simplified logograms, symbols that stood for the commodities they were counting. A stylized jar for wine, a simplified sheaf for wheat, a clear pictogram for a goat, a simple crosshatch for textiles. And crucially, they used a numbering system that we can understand, a clear decimal system of dashes for ones, dots or circles for tens, and larger circles for hundreds. Because of this, we can stand in the stillness of the archive and, to a limited degree, read over the scribe's shoulder. We can watch the Minoan economy in motion. We understand the lists. This tablet records a delivery of 50 jars of olive oil to a palace shrine. This one enumerates a flock of 80 sheep allocated to a shepherd in the hills. This one is a list of rations, barley and figs, for a group of textile workers, perhaps the women who wove the elaborate flounced skirts seen in the frescoes. We see the flow of goods, the intricate redistribution of wealth that was the palace's primary function. We can trace the arteries of this complex society, but we cannot hear its heart. For here is the central, tantalizing mystery. The syllabic signs, the sounds of the language itself, remain undeciphered. The Minoan tongue is lost. We have the phonetic script, but we do not have the key. No bilingual text, no Cretan Rosetta Stone has ever been found to unlock the sounds. We do not know what they called their island, their palaces, or their gods. The language of Linear A, which holds the precise mundane details of their daily administration, simultaneously guards their deepest secrets. It is a locked door. We can see the inventory of the room beyond, but we cannot hear the conversations held within it. This elegant, unread script is the true, undeciphered God of the Minoan world. It is the voice of an authority we can see but not name. The tablets, fired hard in the conflagrations that would later destroy the palaces, have survived for 4 millennia, their neat, linear incisions as clear as the day they were made. They are the silent witnesses to a complex bureaucracy, a world of inventories and allocations, of a society so orderly that it required this profound intellectual tool to manage itself. The palaces of Knossos and Phaistos, awash in the color of Kamari's wear, were not just centers of art, but centers of information. Their power built as much on these small, damp pieces of inscribed clay as on the massive dressed stone blocks of their foundations. The script was the operating system for a civilization at its first great peak, a system that worked perfectly, recording the pulse of a world that seemed stable and eternal, a world entirely unaware of the deep, tectonic fragility beneath its feet. The world of the old palaces, with its spinning wheels and its flowing, unread script, felt perfect and perpetual. The rhythms were deep and established, the cycle of the olive harvest, the firing of the Kamares kilns, the sailing of the trade ships on the summer winds, and the meticulous accounting of every jar and every sheaf of wheat. In the grand halls of Knossos and Phaistos, the light streamed down the painted wells, illuminating floors that had been polished by generations of ritual and daily life. The air in the magazines was cool and heavy with the scent of time-infused olive oil and sweet fermented wine held in rows of giant, silent pithoi. The civilization was a finely tuned instrument, every part resonating in harmony, its power resting on the seemingly infallible, solid bedrock of the island itself. It was a confidence born of 1,000 years of stability, a belief that the red earth beneath their feet was the one eternal constant. And then, in a single, unuttered moment, the constant fractured. It did not begin with a warning. There was no sound at first, but a feeling, a deep, visceral lurch, as if the entire island of Crete had been struck from beneath by an impossibly large, unseen hand. It was a sensation that defied all logic. The ground, the very definition of stillness and reliability, suddenly became a fluid, moving, treacherous thing. A low, subterranean groan began to rise, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the sound of the island's limestone bones grinding together in an agony that had been building for 1,000 years. Birds, startled from the cypress groves, exploded into the sky, a dark, chaotic cloud against the bright, indifferent blue. Then the main shockwave hit, a catastrophic, rolling violence that tore the palaces apart. The sound was no longer a groan, but a deafening, continuous roar, the sound of a mountain collapsing. In the central courts, the meticulously paved stones, so level and true, split apart and heaved, rising and falling like the surface of a storm-tossed sea. The massive, tapered cypress columns that held up the porticos and the upper floors, those proud, red-painted pillars, jumped from their stone bases. Their heavy timber beams twisted, groaned, and then snapped, their sharp, cracking reports lost in the larger din. The architecture of light and air, with its open verandas and wide light wells, proved fatally vulnerable. In the magazines, the rows of pithoi, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, began to topple. They fell like a line of colossal dominoes, their ceramic bodies shattering on the stone floors, instantly releasing a tidal wave of oil and wine that mixed with the rising clouds of plaster dust. The scent of spilled abundance, so carefully gathered and recorded, filled the air, a sudden, tragic perfume. In the workshops, the kilns split, the delicate, eggshell-thin Kamares ware stored on the shelves was thrown to the ground, crushed into 1,000,000 polychrome fragments. In the archive rooms, the scribes' neat clay tablets were scattered, their lists interrupted mid-count, their world of perfect order vanishing into chaos. The upper stories, built of lighter mud brick and timber framing, pancaked. Whole sections of the palace, the residential quarters and the state apartments, collapsed inward upon themselves, their frescoed walls pulverizing, their contents, wooden thrones, fine textiles, carved ivory, crushed in an instant. The grand staircase at Phaistos, that monument to public theater, buckled, its wide stone treads splitting down the middle. The very labyrinth that had been a testament to Minoan complexity became a deadly, suffocating trap, its corridors blocked, its light wells choked with falling masonry. The sun, which had been the organizing principle of their world, was blotted out by a dense, impenetrable cloud of gray-white dust that poured from the collapsing structures, turning midday into a suffocating, terrifying twilight. For several long, unendurable minutes, the island shook, and then, as suddenly as it began, the motion stopped. An immense, profound silence descended, heavier and more complete than any silence that had come before. It was a silence broken only by the settling of the ruins, the distant crackle of fires beginning to catch in the spilled oil, and the first, stunned cries of the survivors. From Knossos in the north to Paistos in the south, from Malea on the coast to the villas in the countryside, the blow was universal. The entire palatial system, the network of power that had taken centuries to build, was brought to its knees in a single afternoon. The old palace period was over, buried beneath the rubble of its own monumental ambition. The survivors, pulling themselves from the wreckage, stood in a landscape made alien, the familiar proud lines of their world erased, the red earth quiet once more, waiting, as if it had only paused to draw a great tectonic breath. The silence that fell upon the ruins was heavy and absolute, a thick blanket of pulverized plaster and profound shock. The dust, which had turned the brilliant Cretan noon into a gray, uniform twilight, began to settle, coating the jagged edges of the broken world, filling the impressions of the scattered, unread linear A tablets. For a time, there was only the sound of shifting rubble and the slow, acrid burn of the fires feeding on the spilled oil. It was a pause, a moment of collective, uncomprehending grief for a world that had, in an instant, been rendered an artifact. It would have been easy, perhaps, for the survivors to abandon these haunted, broken places, to disperse back into the hills and the coastal caves of their distant ancestors, to let the red earth and the wild olive trees reclaim the wreckage of their ambition. But this did not happen. The Minoan spirit, it seems, was not defined by its fragility, but by an almost immediate, astonishing resilience. The great, paved central courts, though fractured and heaved, had held their ground. They remained the symbolic, sacred anchors of the civilization. The decision was made, not to flee, but to rebuild. To clear the rubble was an act of immense faith and labor. Stone by stone, the collapsed walls of the old palaces were dismantled. The crushed pithoi were cleared, the charred beams were pulled from the wreckage, and the dead were buried. They were not just clearing a space, they were preparing a foundation, sifting through the physical memory of their own past, and upon that very same, now chastened ground, they began to erect something new, something that was not a mere copy, but a transfiguration. This was the birth of the new palace period, the neo-palatial age, and it was built with a new, profound, and hard-won wisdom. The architects and engineers who planned this renaissance had learned a terrible lesson from the Earth's tremor. Their new designs would be grander, more complex, and yet, in their very bones, engineered to yield to the world's deep, tectonic size. The most visible sign of this new era was the stone itself. The rough cyclopean boulders and mud brick superstructures of the old palaces were largely abandoned. In their place, a new precision emerged from the island's limestone quarries. Vast blocks were cut, not just hewn, but dressed with meticulous care. This was ashlar masonry. The sound that now filled the air was not the dull thud of the stone hammer, but the sharp, high-pitched clink of the fine bronze chisel as masons worked the surfaces of the blocks to a perfect, smooth, almost luminous flatness. These massive, pale gold blocks were fitted together with such astonishing precision that in many places no mortar was needed, the pure weight and friction of their perfect surfaces holding them in place. The foundations and the ground floors of the new Knossos, Vistos, and Malia were now built of this magnificent, clean-lined stone, giving them an appearance of permanence and geometric purity that was entirely new. The walls rose sheer and true, their smooth faces catching the strong Mediterranean light, reflecting a society that was richer, more organized, and more masterful in its craft than ever before. This was not the architecture of a fledgling power. It was the architecture of an empire at its zenith. But the true genius was hidden within these beautiful walls. The builders now integrated a skeleton of massive timber beams, whole trunks of ancient cypress, squared and cured, directly into the stone framework. These beams ran horizontally through the masonry and rose vertically at the corners and junctions. This was not mere decoration. It was a sophisticated anti-seismic technology. The wood, with its tensile strength and flexibility, could absorb the shock of an earthquake, allowing the structure to twist and flex without shattering, the timber groaning and complaining while the stone remained intact. This half-timbering, with its grid of dark wood against the pale stone, became a defining aesthetic of the new palaces, a visible, structural memory of the Great Shaking. With this new, resilient framework, they built up. The new palaces were not just wider, they were taller, rising 2, 3, perhaps even 5 stories in places, a true vertical labyrinth. This ambition created a new problem: how to illuminate the deep, inner chambers of such a massive structure. The solution was the perfection of the light well. Those were not mere shafts, but grand architectural voids, often lined with columns and painted plaster that acted as the lungs and eyes of the palace. They funneled the bright, clear Cretan air and the brilliant sunlight down into the very heart of the complex, illuminating the grand staircase at Knossos, its shallow gypsum steps zigzagging upward, its walls blooming with the first of the new frescoes. The new palaces were intricate and complex, yet they were never dark, never oppressive. They were places of movement, air, and flowing managed light. From the ruins of the old palaces, a phoenix civilization had risen, not only restoring what was lost, but using the very agent of its destruction as a catalyst for a more brilliant, more sophisticated, and more resilient golden age. The rubble of the past was buried, becoming the literal foundation for a new, grander vision. The new walls, built of precise sun-white ashlar, stood as a testament to a people who had faced oblivion and answered it not with fear, but with an unparalleled burst of creative and engineering genius, their confidence reborn in stone. The new palace at Knossos, reborn from the rubble and fire-scarred foundations of the old, was more than just a building. It was an organism. It was the supreme expression of the Neo-Palatial age, a sprawling, intricate structure that covered over 6 acres of the gentle hill, a place of such bewildering complexity that its memory would echo down through the millennia, long after its walls had crumbled, as the very definition of a maze, the labyrinth. To approach it was not to face a single, monumental facade, a great gate, or a defensive wall. There were no defensive walls. The palace was unfortified, its security vested not in stone ramparts, but in the sea, in the fleet, in a profound and serene confidence. It presented no single, simple face to the world. Instead, it was entered through multiple, relatively unassuming portals, each one leading the visitor into a web of passages and courts, a deliberate architecture of spatial disorientation. The plan was not a symmetrical, preordained grid. It was a cellular, almost biological growth, an accumulation of chambers, corridors, staircases, and light wells that had clustered around the great, immutable void of the central court over centuries. This court remained the heart, the vast, paved lung that oriented the entire structure, but the body built around it was a dense, multi-storied puzzle. The western wing, facing the court, was the most formal, its smooth ashlar facade presenting a unified, rhythmic face of stone and timber. This was the palace's public and religious core, but to move within it was to be immediately enveloped in the logic of the labyrinth. Corridors were long, narrow, and dog-legged, turning abruptly, their purpose seemingly to control the flow of traffic, to separate the initiated from the profane, to guide a procession along a very specific, ritualized path. One would step from the brilliant, almost blinding sunlight of the court into a cool, shadowed antechamber, the air suddenly still and tasting of gypsum dust and something ancient, perhaps the faint, lingering scent of sacred oils. From here, a doorway would lead not into a grand hall, but perhaps into another, smaller corridor, which in turn might open onto a small, sunken lustral basin, a small, stone-lined room, stepped and perhaps used for ritual purification, before another turn revealed the entrance to a shrine. The palace played with the senses, a constant orchestrated transition between light and dark, open and enclosed, public and private. The effect was not one of fear, but of managed mystery, a slow revelation of the sacred, Getty images. The true marvel of this vertical labyrinth was its circulatory system, the staircases and the light wells. To connect the 3, 4, or even 5 stories of the palace, the Minoan architects designed the grand staircase in the eastern wing, a masterpiece of engineering and aesthetics. It did not ascend in one single tiring flight. Instead, it was a wide, shallow, zigzagging procession, its treads made of pale, luminous gypsum, a stone so soft it seemed to glow, its surface cool and smooth beneath the foot. The staircase wrapped around a central, colonnaded light well, a vast open shaft that plunged from the sky, through the upper floors, down to the lowest levels. As one ascended or descended, the quality of the light was constantly in motion, dappled by the shadows of the columns, the air flowing freely, cooled by the stone, and the columns themselves were a Minoan signature, one of the most distinctive in the ancient world. They were carved from the trunks of immense cypress trees, but they were installed upside down. They were tapered, wider at the top than at the bottom, a deliberate, elegant inversion that gave them a sense of lightness, as if they were not being crushed by the weight of the roof above, but were actively, gracefully supporting it. They rested on simple, circular stone bases and were topped by a wide, round, cushion-like capital. They were painted a deep, rich, hematite red, their vivid color a stunning contrast to the pale gypsum floors and the sky blue or saffron yellow of the frescoed walls. To stand in these halls was to be in a forest of deep red pillars, their polished wooden surfaces catching the light that streamed down from the bright, open wells. This complex plan integrated every aspect of life. There was no separation between church and state, workshop and residence. The eastern wing, with its grand staircase, also housed the workshops of the palace's most skilled artisans. The sound of the bronzesmith's hammer, the tap 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 of the ivory carver's chisel, the fine abrasive shush of stone vases being polished with sand would have drifted up the light wells, mingling with the sounds of court life. The western wing held the shrines, but also the vast, cool, subterranean magazines, the storerooms, a parallel labyrinth of long, dark corridors, lined with the giant, womb-like pithoi jars, their tops sealed with clay, their contents, the oil and wine that were the state's liquid gold, tracked by the scribes in the archive rooms just above. Deep within the palace, in the Queen's Megaron, was a suite of rooms of almost whimsical, intimate grace, complete with one of the most sophisticated drainage and sanitation systems the world had ever seen, with terracotta pipes carrying fresh water in and wastewater out. This was the labyrinthine plan, not a trap, but a system. It was an organic, breathing structure, a place of endless corridors designed to manage the flow of goods, people, and ritual, all illuminated by the brilliant captured sunlight of the light wells, all supported by the inverted, blood-red columns, a perfect, intricate, and living machine built for a civilization at the apex of its power. We move from the sun-drenched expanse of the central court, our eyes adjusting as we pass through a columned doorway into the comparative cool of the western wing. The sound of the open air is immediately muffled, replaced by the faint echo of our own movement on the worn gypsum floors. We are in the public, ceremonial heart of Knossos, a dense cluster of rooms dedicated to ritual and administration. A wide, shallow staircase, its steps the same pale, luminous gypsum, leads down into a small, elegant antechamber. Stone benches, polished smooth by centuries of use, line the plaster walls, a place of waiting, of quiet anticipation. The air is still, carrying the faint, dry, mineral scent of the gypsum stone. From this room, a set of wide doors, the polythyron system, would have stood open, granting access to a chamber of singular importance. This is the throne room, yet the name, given by its modern discoverers, conjures images of grandeur that the space itself politely refutes. It is not a vast, echoing hall built to intimidate. It is a room of intimate, almost human proportions, its ceiling low, its atmosphere one of deep, hallowed quiet. Along the walls, the same simple gypsum benches continue, suggesting this was a place for a select group to sit in council or witness a ceremony. The light is indirect, filtering in from the antechamber and a small high window, pooling on the floor and illuminating the deep, rich, wine red of the frescoed dado. But it is the north wall that commands all attention, for it is here, set flush against the plaster, that the throne itself waits. It is perhaps the oldest surviving throne in all of Europe, yet it is a seat of startling simplicity. It is not carved from imported diorite, not overlaid with sheets of hammered gold, not inlaid with lapis lazuli or carnelian. It is carved from a single solid block of the island's own pale, gray-white gypsum, the same humble, soft stone used for the floors and benches. It is an extension of the palace's own earth. Its form is elegant, the seat slightly hollowed, the armrests simple blocks. The high back rises and curves at the top in a graceful, undulating wave, a motif that seems to echo the sea, the sacred serpents, or the rolling hills of Crete itself. It is a seat, but it is also a piece of sacred geology, a place where the human form could connect directly to the stone of the island. It is not a throne built for a large, imposing warrior king. It feels scaled for a different kind of occupant, perhaps a queen, or more likely a priestess, the human embodiment of the goddess. It is a seat of ritual, not of military command, and this feeling is amplified, made undeniable by the silent attendants painted on the wall on either side. Flanking the stone chair, two magnificent griffins are frescoed onto the plaster, their forms preserved in the dreamlike, shadowless style of Minoan art. They are not menacing. They are couchant at rest, their lion bodies relaxed, their eagle heads held in an attitude of serene, eternal watchfulness. They are creatures of a borderland, masters of both earth and sky, and they sit not in a throne room, but in an ethereal landscape of waving, stylized papyrus or reed plants, a sacred marsh that separates this world from another. These griffins are the true guardians of the chamber, but they do not guard a man. In all of Minoan art, we find no monumental portraits of a specific king, no grand statues of a pharaoh, no reliefs of a monarch smiting his enemies. The power depicted here is symbolic and mythical and shared. The griffins face the throne, but the throne is empty, as if awaiting a presence, or as if the presence it serves is invisible, divine. This is the central mystery of Minoan power, a labyrinthine palace, an empire of the sea, a complex bureaucracy, and at its very heart, an empty stone chair watched over by mythical beasts. Directly opposite this room, across the antechamber, another short flight of steps leads down into a small, sunken, stone-lined chamber, a lustral basin. This space, with its balustrade of red-painted columns, was clearly for purification, for a ritual cleansing with water, or an anointing with sacred oil before entering the presence of the divine. The proximity is no accident. One would, it seems, be made clean before sitting in council, before entering the hallowed space of the throne. The entire complex is not a royal court, but a sanctuary, a place where the lines between the political and the religious were not just blurred, but entirely non-existent. The throne at Knossos, in its small, dim room, remains a silent testament to this lost system of belief, a seat of authority that seems to derive its power not from conquest, but from the earth, the ritual, and the watchful gaze of the griffins. The stone architecture of the new palaces, with its precise ashlar blocks and soaring timber-laced walls, was the skeleton of this reborn world. The pale, luminous gypsum of the floors and staircases was its skin, but the soul of the labyrinth, its vibrant, breathing life, was carried on the walls themselves, in the flowing, brilliant colors of the frescoes. As one moved from the sun-stunned brightness of the central court into the shaded, columned halls and upper chambers, the world did not grow dim or austere. Instead, it dissolved into a dreamscape of pure, shadowless color, a world painted in the Minoan palette. The deep, earthy hematite red of the columns and the men's skin, the rich yellow ochre of the women's robes, a stark carbon black for the flowing lines of hair, a brilliant lime white for the women's skin, and most arrestingly, a vibrant, otherworldly Egyptian blue. This was not paint applied to a dry, finished wall. This was buon fresco, true fresco, a demanding, unforgiving, and magical technique. The artisan worked on a section of plaster that was still wet, a damp, fresh coat of fine lime that had just been smoothed onto the wall. The mineral pigments, ground into a fine powder and mixed only with water, were then brushed directly onto this receptive, living surface. The chemical reaction that followed was a form of alchemy. As the plaster cured, as it dried and hardened in the warm Cretan air, the lime in the plaster absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, reforming into calcium carbonate, limestone, and in this process, it permanently sealed the pigment particles within its crystalline structure. The color did not sit on the wall. It became part of the wall, a particle of painted stone. This gave the frescoes their unique, matte luminosity, a chalky, breathable depth of color that would resist fading for millennia, its brilliance preserved in the dark earth long after the palace itself had fallen. The hand that held the brush was quick, confident, and imbued with a profound sense of motion. The Minoan line is never static, never stiff. It is a flowing calligraphic whiplash, a single fluid stroke that defines the curve of a dolphin's back, the arch of an elegant eyebrow, or the delicate wind-blown petal of a lily. This style created a world without weight and without shadow. Figures and animals are not anchored to a solid, shaded ground. They float. They exist in an ethereal, flat plane of pure color, a perpetual, sunless afternoon where everything is captured in its most essential, graceful form. This was not a failure of perspective, but a deliberate choice, an aesthetic that valued vitality and essence over the illusion of gritty reality. The subject of this art was life itself, in its most joyful and idealized form. Where the contemporary civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia painted scenes of divine judgment, eternal servitude, and the grim hierarchical power of the king, the Minoans painted a paradise. Nature was their primary muse. They brought the outside world in, dissolving the stone walls into ethereal gardens and impossible aquariums. In the Queen's Megaron, the walls themselves disappeared, replaced by a scene of pure, underwater motion. Great shoals of blue and yellow fish darted through stylized swirling water, while a family of dolphins, their bodies defined by that single, perfect, curving black line, leapt in graceful, perpetual play. To be in this room was to be submerged in a cool, blue, silent sea, a space of profound, imaginative peace. Elsewhere, the walls came alive with a fauna that was both real and mythic. Blue monkeys, their fur rendered in that startling, vibrant, non-natural hue, were depicted climbing on stylized rocks, gathering saffron flowers, their forms sinuous and inquisitive. Partridges, with their intricate plumage, strutted in friezes, and wild goats leaped from painted crags. But it was the human figure that revealed the Minoan ideal of elegance. We see them in fragments, the ladies in blue, their skins a polished, ritual white, their elaborate, curly black hair piled high, their embroidered bodices left open to the waist in the distinctive court style, their lips a dash of red, their one large dark eye rendered in the Egyptian fashion, gazing sideways in profile. They are not individuals, but types, serene, poised, and eternally youthful, caught in a moment of animated conversation, their hands gesturing with delicate grace. This was a world, it seems, blessedly free of war. In the thousands of fragments of Minoan frescoes, There are no scenes of battle, no sieges, no returning conquerors dragging lines of bound captives, no kings exulting in the slaughter of their enemies. The La Parisienne fresco, so named by her discoverer for her modern rouge-lipped charm, is not a queen, but perhaps a priestess, her gaze lively, her form defined by the sacred, knotted sash at her back. The world they painted was one of procession, ritual, and a deep, abiding connection to the natural world. It was a civilization that chose to surround itself in its most sacred and powerful chambers, not with images of terror or domination, but with the dance of dolphins, the chatter of elegant ladies, and the impossible serene beauty of a blue monkey, a vibrant, colorful dream captured in stone. Upon the balustrades of the great staircases, at the gateways to the palaces, and set against the open sky on the flat, plastered roofs, a single, powerful, and enigmatic shape was repeated, carved from the island's pale, enduring limestone. It was a stylized, abstract form, a wide V shape rising from a flat base, its two ends curving gracefully upward and outward to sharpened points. These were the horns of consecration, the most pervasive, silent, and declarative symbol of the Minoan faith. They were the distilled essence of an animal, a simplified geometric echo of a creature that was, in its living form, the absolute center of the culture's ritual imagination. This was the sacred bull. The palace was not just the labyrinth of the king or the sanctuary of the goddess. It was, in a very real sense, the precinct of this magnificent, terrifying beast. The bull was everywhere in the Minoan world. It was a tangible daily presence, a creature of immense physical power that walked the same red earth as the Minoans. It represented a force that was both generative and destructive, the untamable, raw energy of the natural world. Its fertility was the lifeblood of the herds, and its thunderous, unpredictable rage was a metaphor for the earthquakes that shook the very foundations of the island. To the Minoan mind, which saw divinity in the flow of water, the bloom of the lily, and the coil of the serpent, the bull was the ultimate embodiment of terrestrial power. They did not, it seems, worship it as a simple god, but they revered it, studied it, and placed its image at the very center of their most dangerous and spectacular rituals. Its image was impressed into the soft clay of seals. Its head was modeled as a rhaton, or ritual pouring vessel. Its form was painted on the sides of pottery. But its most breathtaking, dynamic, and revealing portrayal was reserved for the new, brilliant frescoes that adorned the walls of Knossos. Here, we move from the static, stone symbol of the horns to the living, breathing, thundering reality of the animal itself, in a scene that unfolds in the brilliant, shadowless, perpetual present of Minoan art. We are no longer in the dim throne room or the quiet queen's megaron. We are, almost certainly, back in the great central court, the vast paved heart of the palace, its perimeter now packed with 1,000 spectators, their faces a blur of white and red ochre, their dark eyes fixed on the spectacle. The air is hot, dry, and thick with tension. The sound is a low, collective murmur from the crowd, overlaid by the sharp, percussive snort and the heavy, pounding thud of hooves on the paved stone. In the center of this vast, open-air arena is the bull. It is a colossal creature, a prime specimen from the island's herds, its massive shoulders bunched with muscle, its coat a deep, rich red, its long, lyre-shaped horns, the very image of the sacred symbol. The artist has captured it not at rest, but in a flying gallop, a stylized, impossible posture, with all 4 feet off the ground, its body elongated, its head thrown back, the very incarnation of thundering forward motion. This is not a beast of burden. It is a force of nature, a partner in a deadly acrobatic dance. And then there are the lepers. They are young, impossibly graceful, and defined by the same whiplash line as the dolphins. They are figures of pure, athletic elegance, their long, black, curling hair streaming behind them, their bodies lean and powerful, clad only in stylized, colorful loincloths and high-laced boots. The fresco, known as the Toreador fresco, depicts 3 of them in 3 distinct sequential moments of the same unbelievable act. On the left, a figure, painted in the conventional red ochre that denotes a male, grasps the charging bull's horns, a moment of absolute, terrifying connection. He is the anchor, the one who takes the full, forward impact, using the beast's own momentum to initiate the leap. In the center, soaring over the bull's broad, powerful back, a second figure is captured in mid-flight. This leper, painted with the ritual, stark white skin that often, though not exclusively, denotes a female participant, is inverted, their hands pressed flat against the bull's spine, their body a perfect, curved arc, a somersault performed on the back of a charging, 1,000-pound animal. This is the heart of the ritual, not a fight, not a slaughter, but a moment of sublime, gravity-defying cooperation. The leper must not break the bull's rhythm, but must flow with it, becoming, for one heart-stopping instant, a part of the beast itself. On the right, a third figure, also painted white, is shown landing, their feet planted firmly on the earth, their arms raised and ready, perhaps to catch the aerialist, or simply having completed their own leap. The entire sequence is a continuous, flowing narrative of human agility and the bull's power. A dance where the penalty for a single misstep, a moment's hesitation, would be catastrophic. This was not, it seems, a bullfight in the modern sense. The bull is not shown wounded or killed. It is revered. The goal was not to conquer the beast, but to touch its power, to vault over the horns of death itself, and to land reborn on the other side. It was a supreme religious ordeal, a coming-of-age ritual, a display of cultural control over the raw chaos of nature, all performed in the sun, in the heart of the palace, for the entire community to witness. The echoes of this central, dangerous relationship would linger for 1,000 years, long after the frescoes had fallen and been buried, the memory of the bull in the labyrinth becoming a dark and twisted myth for a later alien people. But for the Minoans, in the bright noon of their civilization, the bull was not a monster. It was a sacred presence, its horns the symbol that guarded their homes, its power the force they met, not with a sword, but with a leap of breathtaking, courageous, and acrobatic faith. If the thundering, sun-drenched central court was the stage for the bull, the public theater of a ritual that balanced on the edge of death, then the true inner sanctum of the palace lay hidden, deep within the western wing. We must leave the bright, percussive world of the lepers and move into a series of small, dim chambers, places of profound, hallowed stillness. Here in the temple repositories at Knossos, archaeologists would one day clear the rubble of a later destruction and find, in stone-lined cysts sunk beneath the floor, a cache of sacred objects, deliberately buried, a treasure hidden from a coming darkness. And from this compacted earth, they lifted the small, luminous figure that has become the very face of Minoan spirituality, the goddess with serpents. She is not a monumental idol. She is not a colossus of marble or bronze, designed to awe and intimidate the masses. She is small, intimate, barely a foot high, designed to be seen up close, perhaps held. Her very material is exotic, a testament to the Minoans' sophisticated international world. She is not shaped from the island's humble clay, but from faience, a vitreous paste of ground quartz and alkali, a difficult, high-temperature technology learned from the masters of Egypt and Mesopotamia. When fired, it creates a luminous, glassy surface, a vibrant, unnatural blue-green, a substance that seems to capture and hold the light, as if she is lit from within. We see her in her most famous form, her eyes wide, dark, and utterly transfixed, her gaze direct and unwavering. She is the epitome of the Minoan court, dressed in the highest fashion of the new palace period. She wears the characteristic, elaborate, tiered, and flounced skirt, its layers perhaps representing the cultivated fields or the strata of the earth. Her waist is cinched impossibly tight by a wide, holy girdle, and her bodice is a short, fitted jacket that leaves her full, white breasts entirely exposed, an act not of immodesty, but of profound divine symbolism. She is the nurturer, the source of fecundity, the mother of all life, her power displayed with the same open, natural grace as the bloom of a lily. But it is what she holds and what she wears that defines her power. This is not a goddess of the sky. This is a goddess of the earth, a mistress of the chthonic, the subterranean. In each of her small, outstretched hands, she grips a writhing, spotted serpent, their long bodies winding up her forearms in a gesture of perfect, serene control. A third snake coils around her waist and hips, its head rising up her back. Upon her tall, elaborate headdress, a small, lithe feline, a leopard or perhaps a wildcat, sits perched, a calm, watchful predator, signifying her dominion over the untamed forces of the natural world. She is the Potnia Theran, the mistress of animals, the one who holds life and death, the wild and the tame, in her steady, unflinching hands. The snakes are the key. In the warm, dry climate of the Mediterranean, the snake was not a symbol of evil or temptation. It was a benevolent, protective spirit. It was the creature that lived at the earth, that emerged from the cracks in the rock, a living embodiment of the underworld's mysterious, generative power. It shed its skin, a perfect, visible metaphor for rebirth, renewal, and immortality. And on a practical daily level, the snake was the guardian of the household and the palace magazines, the silent hunter that protected the giant pithoi of grain and oil from the rodents that would devour the state's wealth. To hold the snakes aloft was not to banish them. It was to embody their power, to command the fertility of the earth, the cycle of the seasons, and the sacred, life-giving darkness beneath the palace floor. This small faience figure, and others like her, were the focal points of these inner shrines. This was a faith centered on a powerful, primary female divinity. She was the goddess of the palace, the protectress of the home, the source of all abundance. The priestesses, perhaps like the elegant La Parisienne captured in fresco, may have been her living incarnations, dressing in this same ritual costume, their hair elaborately coiled, their arms perhaps adorned with living snakes, their bodies the conduit through which the goddess spoke, and the rituals of the harvest and the home were blessed. While the bull's power was met in the open court with a leap of athletic faith, the goddess's power was met here in the quiet, dim, sacred rooms, a personal chthonic force, her wide, Phaean's eyes staring forward, a silent, knowing link to the deep, dark, fertile earth. The spiritual life of the Minoan, rooted in the dark, fertile earth of the snake goddess's shrine, and celebrated in the sun-drenched, perilous dance with the bull, was not contained by the palace walls. The labyrinth was the center, the heart, but the faith itself was as vast as the island, its arteries running up the limestone flanks of the mountains that formed Crete's rugged, imposing spine. The Minoan gaze was often lifted upward toward the high, remote peaks that pierced the brilliant blue of the sky. The sharp summit of Mount Euctus, presiding over Knossos, like a watchful sentinel, the distant, snow-capped majesty of Mount Ida, and the sacred peaks of the Dicte Range to the east. These were not barriers, they were stairways. They were the liminal, wind-scoured spaces between the human world and the divine, and to climb them was the ultimate act of pilgrimage. This was a worship that required effort, a faith proven by the arduousness of the ascent. Leaving the cultivated, orderly world of the coastal plains and the secure, complex corridors of the palace, the supplicant began the long climb. The path would have been a winding, rocky goat track, rising from the scent of the warm olive groves and thyme-covered foothills into the cooler, thinner air of the high country. The sounds of civilization, the potter's wheel, the smith's hammer, the murmur of the court, would fade, replaced by the shush of the wind through high-altitude pines, the clatter of a dislodged stone, and the high, thin cry of a raptor turning on the thermal currents. The air itself changed, growing cleaner and sharper, the sun more intense, the shadows darker. The destination was not a temple. There were no columns, no frescoes, no light wells. The peak sanctuary was often little more than a natural fissure in the rock, a small plateau, or a low, rough stone wall, temenos, enclosing a patch of the summit. It was a place of profound elemental simplicity, defined by its absolute exposure to the sky, the sun, and the wind. To stand on the summit of Euctus was to be surrounded by a roaring, elemental silence, a place where the air itself felt sacred, vibrating with a power that was ancient and pure. The entire island, from this vantage point, was visible, a long, narrow ship of stone sailing in the vast, encircling, wine-dark sea. It was a place that dissolved the individual, a platform between the earth and the heavens. Here, in this intense, wind-swept solitude, the Minoans left their prayers, not as written words, but as small, humble, physical things. Archaeologists, sifting through the deep, greasy, carbon-black layers of ash and soil that define these sites, have found them in the tens of thousands. They are votive offerings, small hand-molded figurines of reddish clay, hastily shaped by the hopeful and the desperate. They are the physical record of 1,000 years of human need. There are small, crude, human figures, their arms raised in the gesture of adoration. Most poignantly, there are individual disembodied limbs, a clay leg, a hand, an arm, a pair of eyes, left as a direct, desperate plea to the divine for healing. a prayer for a part of the body that was broken, sick, or failing. Alongside the human forms, they left the images of their most precious possessions, thousands of clay animals. Tiny pinched clay bulls, sheep, goats, and even weasels to protect the home, each one a proxy for the real thing, a symbolic offering of the wealth that the goddess of the earth and the god of the sky had provided. They also left the symbols of their faith, miniature clay horns of consecration and small votive bronze blades, including the double axe, the labris, which may have been used in the ritual slaughter of the real animals sacrificed here. For the center of the ritual was fire. Upon the summit, great bonfires were lit, their flames leaping into the wind, their thick, fragrant smoke from cypress wood, pine, and the fat of the sacrifice, rising in a column that would have been visible for miles, a clear signal from the peak, perhaps answering a signal from the palace below. The fires burned hot, and into them the pilgrims cast their offerings. The animal sacrifices were consumed, the bones and pottery from the ritual feasts were broken and mixed into the growing pyre. Over centuries, this created a thick, stratified mound of ash, carbonized bone, and fire-hardened clay figurines, a sacred geological layer cake of pure devotion. This was the mountain's altar, a high, lonely place where the individual Minoan, far from the labyrinthine state, could have a direct, personal, and elemental conversation with the sky, their small, clay prayer left in the wind, sealed in the fire, and absorbed into the earth. The prayers left in the wind on the high ashen altars of the peak sanctuaries were for the health of the body and the health of the herd. But the underlying unspoken plea was for the health of the land, for the success of the harvest that funded the palaces, the frescoes, and the very ships that sailed to fetch the copper and the tin. The Minoan economy, for all its palatial grandeur, rested not on gold ore or silver mines, but on the trinity of the island's agriculture, the silver-green olive, the golden barley, and a third, far more precious and far more delicate crop. To find its source, we must descend from the wind-scoured peaks and walk into the cultivated lowlands in the cool, clear light of an autumn morning, when the fields, having slept through the brutal heat of summer, suddenly and magically bloomed in a vast, low carpet of impossible color. This was the crocus flower, the source of saffron. It was not a plant of imposing stature, but a small, delicate, lilac-purple flower that emerged almost stemless from the red earth, its petals translucent in the morning sun. It was a flower of immense fragility, blooming for only a few short weeks, and inside its ephemeral purple cup, it held the civilization's fragrant red gold, 3 tiny, delicate, thread-like crimson stigmas. These 3 small filaments were the prize, the most expensive and labor-intensive spice in the ancient world, and the Minoans were its first great cultivators and masters. The air in these fields, during the brief, intense harvest, would have been filled with a scent unlike any other, a delicate, honeyed, almost hay-like fragrance that was the very perfume of Minoan wealth. The harvest itself was an act of the almost reverent delicacy. This was not the heavy work of the olive press or the threshing floor. This was a task for the patient and the gentle, a task depicted in the island's art as the domain of women. We see them in the magnificent frescoes that decorated the walls of the villas and palaces. At Akrotiri, On the nearby island of Thera, a whole room was dedicated to the saffron gathering ritual. We see a young woman, her skin the ritual white, her dark hair intricately coiled and jeweled, her robes rich and patterned. She is bending, her body a graceful curve, her painted face a study in serene concentration. Her hand, with its delicate fingers, is not pulling the flower, but is carefully, surgically, plucking only the 3 red stigmas from its heart, leaving the purple bloom intact. This was work that could not be rushed, a task that began at dawn, before the sun grew hot and caused the delicate flowers to wilt, diminishing the power of their stigmas. Basket after basket of these almost weightless, fiery red threads would be collected and brought back to the palace or the villa. The sheer scale of the operation is difficult to comprehend. It would take over 50,000 individual crocus flowers, each one visited and plucked by hand, to produce a single pound of the dried spice. The fields of purple were vast, the number of laborers required immense. This was a quiet, floral, and intensely human engine. In another fresco, this one from Knossos, the gatherers are not human at all, but the sacred ethereal blue monkeys, another sign that this harvest was seen as a divine, or at least deeply ritualized, part of the Minoan world. Once gathered, the stigmas were carefully dried, perhaps on mesh screens laid out on the flat, sun-drenched roofs of the palaces. This process, as the moisture evaporated, concentrated their power, their color, and their scent. The final product was a small, precious, tangled mat of dark red threads, lighter than feathers, but more valuable than metal. This was the true fuel of the Minoan economy. It had 3 interconnected uses. First, it was the island's most sacred dye. When steeped in water, the stigmas released a luminous golden yellow, the crocus color. This was the yellow that painted the backgrounds of the frescoes, the color that adorned the richest robes of the priestesses and the goddesses. It was the color of the sun, of divinity, and of the highest human status. Second, it was a culinary spice, a flavor of unimaginable luxury, used in the most important ritual feasts, perhaps flavoring the wine poured from the ceremonial rhytons or the special breads baked in the palace ovens. And third, it was one of the most powerful and trusted medicines in the ancient pharmacopoeia. The Minoans understood its power. It was a potent analgesic, a treatment for ailments of the stomach, and, perhaps most prized of all, a powerful antidepressant, a substance that brought a feeling of lightness and well-being. It was, in short, a cure for pain and a source of joy. This was the commodity that the Minoan ships carried in small, carefully sealed clay jars, lightweight, non-perishable, and with a value density that dwarfed grain or oil. Saffron was the perfect export. This was what the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of the Levant craved, this red gold thread that could dye their robes, flavor their food, and ease their minds. This was the fragile purple flower that paid for the imported copper, the tin, the ivory, and the Egyptian gold. The strength of the labyrinth, the power of the throne, the beauty of the goddess, all were built, in part, on the delicate, fragrant, and almost impossibly tiny stigma of an autumn flower. The unfortified, open-hearted nature of the palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea was a profound statement, an architectural act of supreme confidence. While the contemporary rulers of the Near East and mainland Greece were building immense, cyclopean walls, and brooding fortified citadels, the Minoans built villas, light wells, and grand staircases open to the world. This serenity was not an act of naivete. It was a calculated expression of power, a power that was not vested in stone ramparts, but in the flowing, kinetic, and dominant force of the sea itself. The island's true wall was not made of limestone. It was a moving, a breathing wooden wall of high-prowed ships that controlled the surrounding waters, with an authority so complete it rendered all other defenses obsolete. This was the Minoan thalassocracy, the rule of the sea, a concept that would echo in the memory of later Greeks as a distant golden age. This was not a thalassocracy in the mold of later empires, not a network of conquered provinces ruled by iron-fisted governors. It was something more subtle, more modern, and perhaps more powerful. It was an empire of commerce, a vast interconnected web of trade routes and cultural influence, held together not by the sword, but by the overwhelming superiority of the Minoan merchant fleet. The Minoan ship, as depicted in the vibrant, detailed frescoes found at Akrotiri, was a masterpiece of naval engineering. It was a long, sleek, and graceful vessel, its hull built from the strong, light, resinous cypress of the island's forests. It was high-prowed and low-sterned, a design that was both elegant and eminently seaworthy, capable of riding the challenging, short-chop waves of the Aegean. While rowers were used for maneuvering in harbors or against the wind, the true engine of this empire was the wind itself, captured in a single, large, square sail hung from a tall, sturdy mast. These ships were swift, capacious, and reliable, the undisputed masters of the eastern Mediterranean. Their captains were not just sailors, they were astronomers, reading the star paths in the night sky, and meteorologists, reading the subtle seasonal shifts of the Meltemi winds that blew from the north, providing a predictable, powerful highway for their commerce. The sea for them was not a barrier, but a road, a great blue, flowing plain that connected them to every known civilization. From the harbors on Crete's northern coast, at Amnissos or Malea, the fleet fanned out. The ships sailed north on the path of their ancestors to the Cyclades, to Melos for its obsidian, and to the emerging warlike citadels of mainland Greece at Mycenae, where the proud, brutish warlords craved the refined, sophisticated art of the palaces. They sailed east to the ancient, wealthy ports of the Levant, to Ugarit and Byblos, where they traded their fragrant oils and exquisite pottery for the raw materials of the continent, copper from Cyprus, ivory, and perhaps the all-important tin, which had to be trekked overland from the distant mountains of Anatolia or beyond. But their most important connection, the artery that fed their golden age, ran south across the Libyan Sea to the ancient monolithic power of Egypt. In the tombs of the 18th dynasty nobles at Thebes, in the Valley of the Kings, we see them. On the painted walls of the tomb of Rekhmir, the vizier to Thutmose III, we see a procession of foreign dignitaries. Among them is a line of men, unmistakable in their Minoan dress, their skin the conventional red ochre, their waists cinched by the tight Minoan belt, their feet clad in high sandals, and their long black curling hair flowing down their backs. They are the Keftiu, the name the Egyptians used for the people of Crete. They come bearing tribute, or more likely, a formal diplomatic exchange of royal gifts, and the objects they carry in their hands are the signature products of the palaces: elegant, bridge-spouted jars, ceremonial bull's head rhytons, and heavy copper ingots. This was a relationship of equals, a respectful, vital commerce between the two great powers of the age. This network established a kind of pax minoica, a Minoan peace. The seas were kept clear of pirates, not by naval patrols of grim-faced marines, but by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Minoan trade fleet. Their dominance was cultural and economic. Settlements across the Aegean, from Miletus on the coast of Anatolia to the islands of the Cyclades, became Minoanized. They built their own, smaller palatial structures. They adopted the Minoan drainage systems. They painted their walls with Minoan-style frescoes of lilies and dolphins, and they used the linear A script. These were not conquered colonies. They were emporia, eager participants in a cultural and economic system that was fashionable, sophisticated, and above all, profitable. The power of Knossos was the power of influence, the power of being the undisputed center of style, technology, and wealth. The fleet, sleek and swift, was the conduit for this power, each ship a thread in the vast, peaceful tapestry that the Minoans had woven across their world, a tapestry that held all of civilization in its web. We let our gaze drift from the grand, unfortified halls of Knossos, leaving the scent of its gypsum dust and the echo of its ritual. We follow the paths of the thalassocracy, those blue water roads plied by the sleek, cypress-hulled merchant ships. We sail north across the bright, open expanse of the Aegean, hopping the stepping stones of the Cyclades. Our destination is an island that served as one of the most vital, wealthy, and brilliant nodes in this vast commercial web, a place that was, in its very essence, a perfect, miniature reflection of the Minoan spirit. This was the island of Thera, known then perhaps as Strong Ale, the Round One, a name that would in time become a terrible geologic irony. It was a volcanic island, a ring of steep, dark cliffs enclosing a vast flooded caldera, its soil rich with ash, producing a uniquely potent wine. On the southern coast of this crescent-shaped island, tucked in a gentle inlet and safe from the prevailing northern winds, a town had grown rich. This was Crete. It was not a provincial backwater, not a rustic outpost. It was a bustling, sophisticated, and stunningly preserved urban center, a Bronze Age Pompeii without the terror, a perfect jewel box of the Minoanized world. It was a harbor town, a linchpin of the trade route, a place where the ships from Crete, heading north to the mainland, and the ships from the mainland, heading south to the empire, would meet, rest, and trade. Its prosperity was built on this constant flowing traffic, on its own skilled artisans, and on the rich, volcanic wine from its hillsides. To walk the streets of Crete in its final, sunlit years is to walk through a world of almost modern, bourgeois comfort. The town was a dense, organic cluster of multi-storied houses, not a palace, but what archaeologists call a zest, or mansions. These were the homes of a wealthy merchant class, and they were built with all the sophisticated anti-seismic technology of the new palaces: strong stone foundations, walls of mud brick laced with a flexible skeleton of timber, and upper stories that rose 2 and 3 floors high. The streets were narrow, paved with stone, and astoundingly, they concealed a complex subterranean sanitation system. Terracotta pipes ran beneath the stones, carrying fresh water into the homes, and in a separate system, carrying wastewater out, a feat of civic engineering that would not be matched in Europe for more than 2 millennia. But it is when we step inside these homes, out of the bright, sea salt air, that the true character of Akrotiri is revealed. The walls were not bare, they were alive, covered from floor to ceiling with frescoes of vibrancy, a skill and a state of preservation that surpass even those of Crete. It is here that we truly see the Minoan worldview captured in a moment. In one room, in the House of the Ladies, the walls dissolve, replaced by a field of blooming scarlet lilies that sprout from stylized volcanic red and yellow mounds. Above them, in the impossibly blue sky, swallows dart and weave, their forked tails a blur of joyful calligraphic motion. It is the spring fresco, a perfect, shadowless, idyllic vision of nature's eternal renewal. In another chamber, we find the saffron gatherers, the young women with their elaborate hairstyles and ritual robes, their delicate fingers plucking the crimson stigmas, their mistress a seated goddess-like figure, attended by a sacred blue monkey and a griffin. The entire industry and its sacred importance are laid bare. In the West House, a long, continuous miniature frieze encircles the room, depicting a grand, festive narrative, the ship procession. Here we see the Minoan fleet in all its glory, not in war, but in celebration. Sleek, painted ships, adorned with flowers and streamers, their sails furled, are paddled from one coastal town to another, their decks crowded with passengers in rich robes. They move toward a harbor town, perhaps Akrotiri itself, where crowds line the shore, their hands raised in welcome. It is a scene of absolute civilized peace, a society celebrating its mastery of the sea, its community, and its prosperity. This was a town of comfortable, cultured, and pious people. Life was good. The large clay pithoi in their basements were full of barley, wine, and olive oil, much of it imported from Crete. The pottery on their tables was the finest Minoan ware, alongside their own local, beautiful, bird-painted jugs. They were literate, as evidenced by the fragments of linear A tablets found in their archives, the neat administrative script tracking the flow of their abundant goods. They lived their lives in rooms painted with the most beautiful art the world had ever seen. They had indoor plumbing, and they had, it seems, no fear. But they lived on a knife edge, in a paradise that was also a prison. The volcano that formed their island, the source of their fertile soil, the very reason for their deep, sheltered harbor, was not dormant. It was sleeping, and its breath was growing shallow, its dreams growing troubled. The people of Akrotiri were living directly on the flank of a supervolcano, one of the most powerful and destructive forces on the planet. They were, in these last perfect, sunlit days, a town of ghosts, their laughter, their songs, the sound of their looms, the scent of their saffron, all hanging in the warm air, a complete, thriving, brilliant civilization, unaware that it was already a memory, a town preserved in time, waiting only for the final, fiery exhalation that would bury it, and in burying it, save it for us, a perfect, silent tableau. The town of Akrotiri, a jewel box of swallows and lilies, had grown quiet in the days, or perhaps weeks, before the end. The earth, the very volcanic rock upon which the merchants had built their cest, had begun to speak in a language of low, trembling growls. The ground had shaken, not with the sharp, sudden violence that toppled the old palaces on Crete, but with a persistent, sickening, rolling tremor that fractured the plaster walls and warned of a deep, magmatic unrest. The people of Thera, living on the breath of a sleeping giant, knew this language. They had packed their most precious, portable things, secured their homes, and they had fled. The streets, which once bustled with the commerce of the thalassocracy, were now empty, silent, and waiting. The frescoes in their sealed rooms held their vibrant, shadowless poses for an audience that was no longer there. The seabirds had vanished. The air was still, heavy, and carried the faint, acrid tang of sulfur. And then, in a single, unearthly moment, the day the sun vanished, the island of Strongs, the round one, ceased to exist. It did not begin as an explosion, but as an exhalation, a single catastrophic continental release of pressure that had been building for millennia. The very center of the island, the plug of the great caldera, gave way. With a sound that was not a bang, but a continuous, deafening, low-frequency roar, a sound that would be heard hours later as a faint, thunderous rumble in the high deserts of Egypt and the rocky hills of Sicily. The volcano erupted. A column of superheated steam, gas, pulverized rock, and white-hot pumice was ejected straight into the sky, a terrifying, churning, inverted tree of black and gray, its branches spreading wide into the silent, frozen vacuum of the stratosphere, 23 miles above the surface of the sea. This was the Plinian column, a sustained, hours-long jet of the Earth's own interior, punching a hole in the sky. It blotted out the sun. The brilliant, high-noon blue of the Aegean was snuffed out in an instant, replaced by an absolute, impenetrable, terrifying darkness. It was a day without a sun, a midday night, lit only by the horrifying internal red-orange lightning that flickered within the volcanic cloud itself, a storm of pure geology. Then the fallout began. It was not a rain of ash, but a deluge of pumice, small, lightweight, air-filled stones. The frothy, flash-cooled magma began to rain down upon the island, covering the empty town of Akrotiri, filling its streets, its courtyards, its open windows. The weight was immense, and the sound was a constant abrasive hiss, a billion falling particles that buried the lilies and the dolphins, the blue monkeys and the saffron gatherers under a thick, insulating blanket of pale gray stone, a shroud that would in its suffocating totality perfectly preserve them. This sustained, violent emptying of the magma chamber, the very heart of the volcano, lasted for hours. The mountain was hollowing itself out from within, and then the inevitable happened. The roof of this new, immense void, the island itself, could no longer support its own weight. The round one began to collapse. With a groan that shook the entire basin of the Aegean, the center of the island, an area miles wide, fell in upon itself, plunging thousands of feet into the now empty boiling magma chamber below. It was this collapse, this catastrophic, almost instantaneous displacement of billions of tons of rock that spoke directly to the sea. The sea responded. The collapse of the caldera acted as a colossal piston. First, the water was drawn away from the surrounding islands, a massive, unnatural draining, as the sea rushed in to fill the new, gaping void. Shores for miles around were exposed, the seabed laid bare, fish flapping in the sudden sulphurous air. And then, the sea, having filled the chasm, rebounded. It was not a wave. It was the entire ocean, displaced, rising up in a series of colossal, concentric oscillations. The tsunami, a wall of dark, churning, ash-choked water, perhaps hundreds of feet high as it left the epicenter, began its silent, unstoppable, high-speed journey outward in all directions. But the eruption was not finished. As the sea rushed into the new, white-hot caldera, it met the remaining magma. The result was a secondary series of explosions, phreatomagmatic blasts of incomprehensible power, its steam, and ash. The Plinian column, now unstable, began to collapse upon itself, unleashing the most destructive force of all, the pyroclastic flow. This was a glowing, superheated avalanche, a cloud of incandescent gas, ash, and rock, heavier than air, moving at the speed of a hurricane, hundreds of miles per hour. It scoured the remaining fragments of the island, flash boiling the sea where it touched, a river of fire that annihilated all remaining life, turning the last vestiges of Thera into a sterile, steaming black and gray wasteland. The island was no longer round. It was a fractured, hollowed-out crescent, a gaping, steaming wound in the surface of the sea. The air for 1,000 square miles was an unbreathable fog of fine, glassy silicate dust. And in the darkness, in the stinking, sulphurous gloom, the great, silent, dark water mounds of the tsunami, their journey barely begun, were already racing south, their energy undiminished, their destination the northern, unprepared and peaceful shores of Crete. The column of blackness that had replaced the island of Thera stood on the northern horizon, an immovable pillar of roiling stratospheric cloud, a monument to a world that had just ended. On Crete, 70 miles to the south, the brilliant, high-noon sun vanished, not as if eclipsed, but as if it had been erased. A profound, premature, and terrifying twilight fell over the unfortified palaces, a deep, unnatural gloom that silenced the birds in the olive groves and stilled the breeze in the central courts. The air, suddenly cold, became thick and still, heavy with a shared island-wide moment of held breath. Then a low, percussive, concussive thump rolled across the land, a sound that was felt in the chest as much as it was heard, the distant, delayed thunder of the mountain's collapse. It was the sound of the void, the sound of the sea being given its terrible command. Before the water arrived, the air itself became a plague. The high-altitude ash cloud, drifting south on the winds of the upper atmosphere, began to release its burden. It was not a rain, but a fall. A fine, gray-white silicate dust, sharp and glassy, began to descend like a slow, soundless snow. It coated the vibrant, painted frescoes on the open-air verandas. It settled on the red-painted columns. It built in the corners of the horns of consecration. The scent of sulfur, the breath of the volcano's interior, was suddenly everywhere, stinging the eyes and catching in the throat. The very air which had been the clear, life-giving medium of the Minoan world was now a gritty, abrasive, and suffocating fog. And then the sea, their guardian, their wall, their great blue commercial road, betrayed them. On the northern and eastern coasts, at the bustling, undefended harbor towns of Knossos, the main port of Knossos, Malea, and the artisan center of Maklos, the first sign was not a wave, but its opposite. The sea simply left. With a vast, quiet, sighing exhalation, the water withdrew from the shore, pulling back for hundreds of yards, revealing a dark, alien, and glistening landscape of the seabed. Anchored ships, The sleek, proud vessels of the thalassocracy were left stranded on their sides, their hulls exposed on the suddenly dry sand. Fish flapped in the new, shallow, stinking pools. It was a moment of profound, unnatural, and terrifying silence. This was the trough, and the crest that followed was not a breaking, curling, white-capped wave. It was something far more primal. It was the sea itself, the entire northern horizon, rising up in a great, dark, silent, ash-choked mound. It was not a wall of water. It was a wall of ocean, a liquid, advancing cliff that moved with the terrible, unhurried, irresistible momentum of geology. It did not roar. It hissed, its surface covered in a churning gray-brown carpet of floating pumice stones from the eruption, a vast, abrasive raft of volcanic debris riding the crest. When it struck the shore, it did not crash. It inundated. It was a scouring, suffocating liquid bulldozer. The wave, or series of waves, poured over the coastal plains. It did not just destroy the harbor towns, it erased them. Stone blocks from the villas were plucked from their foundations and carried inland like dice. The proud, cypress-hulled ships of the Minoan fleet, the very instruments of their pax Minoica, were lifted as one, not as vessels, but as driftwood. They were smashed against the low hills, splintered, and deposited in fragments, miles from the coast, tangled in the olive groves and the ruins of the farmhouses. This was the crippling. In a single hour, the Minoan thalassocracy, the naval power that had guaranteed the island's peace and prosperity, was annihilated. The ships were gone. The harbors were choked with a thick, sterile sludge of mud, pumice, and the splintered remains of their own commercial empire. As the great mass of water receded, sluggish and thick with debris, it left behind a transformed world. The fertile coastal plains, the source of so much of the island's grain, were now a sterile, salt-poisoned, and stinking morass. But the immediate, suffocating problem was the ash. For days, perhaps weeks, it continued to fall, a persistent, choking, gray rain. It buried the fields, turning the vibrant green of the barley and the silver of the olive leaves into a uniform, monochromatic, and deathly gray. The leaves, coated in this heavy, abrasive dust, could no longer breathe, no longer photosynthesize. The crops in the fields were smothered. The olive trees, the work of generations, were scorched by the acidic, fluorine-laced fallout. In the palaces, the people were safe from the wave, but not from the consequences. They were now isolated, their ports destroyed, their fleet gone. The sky was a low, oppressive, sulphurous ceiling. The air was a torment. The fields were dead. The intricate, interconnected, globalized world of the new palaces, built on the delicate, fragrant export of saffron and the effortless mastery of the sea, had been profoundly and perhaps fatally broken. The sound that now filled the world was not the whir of the potter's wheel or the ritual thump of the bull leper's feet. It was the sound of a gritty wind blowing across a silent, ash-strewn shore. The fine, glassy volcanic ash that had fallen like a gray snow upon the island did not simply wash away. It settled, choking the high pastures, turning the rich, red earth of the Masara plain acidic and sterile, poisoning the very springs of Minoan wealth. The agricultural surplus that had fueled the great palaces for 500 years dwindled to a pittance. The olive groves, their leaves burned by the acidic fallout, ceased to bear fruit. The vast Minoan-controlled web of the sea, its fleet of sleek cypress ships, now a mass of splinters on the ocean floor or rotting in the pumice-choked harbors, was broken. The Pax Minoica, that serene, unchallengeable control of the trade routes, had evaporated in a cloud of steam, and the sudden, catastrophic vacuum of power did not go unnoticed. The surrounding world, long held in civilized orbit by Minoan taste and commercial dominance, was a world of ambitious, rising, and far more brutal powers. From the north, from the Greek mainland, they had watched. These were the peoples we now call the Mycenaeans, the warlords of the Argive plain, the builders of the Cyclopean, fortified citadels at Mycenae, Terans, and Pylos. They were a different people entirely, speaking a different language, worshipping different gods. They were a warrior aristocracy, a society that celebrated the individual hero, the raider, the wielder of the long bronze sword. They had been, for centuries, the junior partners, the eager, somewhat brutish consumers of Minoan luxury. Their own art was a stiffer, more formal, and heavier imitation of the flowing, natural grace of Crete. But now, their tribute of Keftiu, as seen in the Egyptian tombs, ceased. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The student, sensing the master's mortal weakness, had come to inherit the house. Their arrival on Crete was likely not a single grand invasion, not a vast armada landing on the ash-strewn shores. It was more insidious, a gradual, opportunistic infiltration that met a population weakened, disorganized, and perhaps starving. They came as mercenaries, as warlords offering protection, as a new armed elite settling into the power vacuum. And their presence was felt most profoundly at the greatest palace of all, at Knossos, while the other major centers at Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were struggling, devastated by the economic collapse and perhaps local uprisings. Knossos seems to have been swiftly repaired, its functions restored, but under a new and fundamentally different management. A new, harsher presence was felt in the labyrinthine corridors. The change was audible, visible, and tangible. A new sound echoed in the central court, the hard, percussive clatter of the horse-drawn chariot, not as a ritual object, but as a high-speed vehicle of war and a symbol of a new, mobile military aristocracy. The artifacts of this new elite began to appear, objects of a character entirely alien to the Minoan spirit. In new graves, we find the long, bronze, mainland-style rapier, a thrusting sword designed for dueling, not ritual. We find bronze greaves, armor for the shins, and, most tellingly, the grim, striking boar's tusk helmet. This was a potent, barbaric, and protective piece of headgear, constructed from dozens of curved, sharpened tusks, sliced and stitched in rows onto a leather cap, a helmet that spoke of the hunt, of brute force, and of a warrior ethos. It was the antithesis of the bare-headed, long-haired, athletic grace of the Minoan bull-leaper. But the most profound and undeniable evidence of this new mastery was found in the old, familiar archive rooms. The scribes still sat in the cool, dim chambers, their hands still shaping the damp, palm-sized pillows of clay. But the script they incised with their styluses was no longer the elegant, flowing, and unread linear A. A new script had taken its place, one that was clearly adapted from the old, yet stiffer, more utilitarian, and unmistakably different. This was linear B. For millennia, this script too remained a mystery, until the mid-20th century, when a young architect named Michael Ventris achieved the impossible. He deciphered it, and the language it recorded, the voice that spoke from these final Gnossian tablets, was not the lost, unknown tongue of the Minoans. It was Greek, an archaic, early, and recognizable form of the language that would one day be written by Homer and Plato. The Mycenaeans had not just conquered the palace, they had co-opted its entire sophisticated, bureaucratic machinery for their own purposes. And the tablets, now readable, give us a chilling, clear-eyed view into this new world. The lists are still there, the obsessive accounting, but the content has changed. The scribes of Linear B are not counting saffron and lilies. They are counting war. The tablets are meticulous, grim inventories of military hardware, Wo-Ra-E, thorax or body armor, helmets, spears, bronze ingots allocated to weaponsmiths. They are obsessed with chariots, listing them in various states of repair, with and without wheels. They count flocks of sheep, not for their wool's fine dye, but for its use in the military. They list Eketa, the companions or followers, a warrior class, and a Wa-Naka, a word for king, the Anax, alongside a Rawa-Keta, leader of the people, a military commander. Knossos had been transformed. It was no longer the serene, artistic, and religious center of a maritime peace. It was the occupied administrative capital of a Mycenaean Greek military garrison, a feudal overlordship that was now using the Minoans' own greatest invention, their bureaucracy, to count, to control, and to rule them. The labyrinth was still standing, but its soul had been replaced. The new Mycenaean-controlled Knossos was an island unto itself, an administrative and military fortress of Linear B script, boar's tusk helmets, and the sharp metallic sound of the chariot. It was a place of grim, obsessive accounting, its new masters cataloging their spears and their armor, their focus turned inward, toward control, their backs turned to the memory of the sea. But beyond the low hill of Knossos, the rest of Crete, the true native Minoan heartland, was a wounded, struggling landscape. The ash-choked fields, the salt-poisoned plains, and the pumice-filled harbors had dealt a blow from which the other great centers, the southern majesty of Phaistos, the coastal hub of Malea, the wealthy villas like Agia Triada, had never fully recovered. They were trying. They had partially rebuilt, their communities clinging to the old ways, their potters still shaping clay, their scribes perhaps still incising the flowing, native tongue of Linear A. They were survivors, a network of weakened but still Minoan towns, existing in the shadow of the new alien power that now resided in their greatest palace. This fragile, fractured coexistence, this uneasy quiet between the occupied Greek-speaking north and the struggling Minoan south, was a state of tension that could not endure. The new masters of Knossos, with their warrior ethos, were not partners, they were rulers. And the island, it seems, was not large enough for different worlds. A new, final, and deliberate catastrophe was about to be unleashed, one that had nothing to do with the deep, tectonic anger of the earth. This was a human fire, a fire of conquest, a final brutal tidying up of the historical record. Around 1375 BCE, a different kind of smoke began to rise from the Cretan landscape. It was not the gray, sulphurous plume of a volcano, but the dark, oily, acrid smoke of burning cypress beams, of melting olive oil, of a civilization being put to the torch. This was not a single, island-wide event, but a rapid, sequential, and systematic wave of destruction, a campaign of fire that rolled across the island, its target every remaining center of native Minoan power. We must imagine the arrival of the chariot-borne warriors, the Iketa from the Knossos tablets, their bronze-tipped spears glinting, their boar's tusk helmets a vision of grim, foreign authority. At Phaistos, the southern palace that had once rivaled Knossos, the fire was swift and all-consuming. The grand staircase, which had survived the earthquake, was now blackened by soot, its gypsum treads cracked by the intense, deliberate heat. The archive rooms, with their last precious linear A tablets, were baked hard in the inferno, the unread language of the Minoans sealed by the very fire that was silencing its speakers. At the nearby opulent royal villa of Agia Triada, a wealthy, smaller palatial center, the destruction was the same. The flames licked at the frescoed walls, turning the painted lilies and the elegant ladies to black, flaking char. The storerooms, filled with the last of the Masara Plains harvest, were set ablaze, the giant pithoi cracking, their contents fueling the conflagration. The wave moved east. At Malea, on the coast, the great paved central court, which had seen the first palaces rise, was now filled with the roar of a firestorm, the heat so intense it vitrified the clay storage vessels, melting them into slag. At Gornia, a perfectly preserved Minoan town of artisans, the small, stone-paved streets ran with the rendered burning oil from its workshops. And finally, at the far eastern tip of the island, the palace of Zakros, a remote and wealthy trading hub that had direct links to the Levant, a place that had largely escaped the worst of the volcano's ash, was met with the same methodical human violence. Its own archive of linear A tablets, its own unique, beautiful pottery, its own specialized workshops, all were consumed, baked, and buried. This was a fire of erasure. It was a brutal, political act designed to sever the remaining heads of the old Minoan Hydra, to ensure that no rival, no other administrative center, no other source of native power could ever rise again to challenge the new masters. And in this, it was chillingly perfectly successful. The Minoan palatial civilization, as a widespread, indigenous, and interconnected system, was over. And through it all, one palace did not burn. Knossos, the labyrinth, the new Greek-speaking administrative center, was mysteriously, pointedly spared. The fires that consumed every other major site on the island stopped at the borders of its domain. The implication is dark, cold, and unavoidable. The masters of Knossos, the speakers of Greek, were not the victims of this fire. They were its source. They were the ones holding the torch. The final palace fires were the act of a new, central, and militaristic power consolidating its grip, wiping the slate clean, and ensuring that the only voice of authority left on the entire island of Crete was its own, its commands now written in the sharp, new, and victorious script of Linear B. The great fire-spared palace of Knossos, now a lone Greek-speaking outpost in a landscape of blackened, silent ruins, continued to function. But its spirit was broken. It was no longer the vibrant heart of a thalassocracy, the serene center of an artistic and religious world. It was a bureaucratic husk, an occupying power's headquarters, its scribes meticulously counting spears and chariot wheels, their world reduced to the grim algebra of military control. This final, hybrid, Mycenaean Minoan phase was a long, slow twilight, a gradual fading of the brilliant polychrome light. The corridors of the labyrinth, once alive with the scent of lilies and the murmur of priestesses, now echoed with the harsh consonants of a new mainland tongue. This, too, would end around 1200 BCE as part of the vast, mysterious, and violent cataclysm that brought down the entire Bronze Age world, toppling the Mycenaean citadels on the mainland and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. Knossos itself finally fell, consumed by a last definitive fire that baked its linear B tablets into permanence and scattered its new masters. The palace, the labyrinth, was finally, truly empty. The last scribe's hand was stilled. The last red column collapsed, and the great ashlar blocks began their slow tumble. The wind, sweeping down from the sacred, now abandoned peak of Juktas, blew the light, dry ash of this final fire through the deserted central court. The island of Crete, exhausted by catastrophe, both natural and human, entered a new, simplified, and impoverished era. The complex, centralized, literate world of the palaces was gone, replaced by small, impoverished, and isolated hilltop villages, places of refuge where people lived in fear, their gaze turned inward. Writing itself vanished from the Aegean for 400 years. The vibrant, interconnected, sophisticated civilization of the Minoans sank completely beneath the dark, silent soil of this new Greek Dark Age. But a thing so great, so powerful, and so strange as the Minoan civilization does not disappear without leaving a ghost. It does not vanish without leaving a deep, resonant, and disturbing memory. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had ruled Knossos, and the generations of mainlanders who had traded with, feared, and admired the power of Crete before its fall, had carried stories back with them. These were stories told around the hearths, in their own grim, smoky megarons, stories of a fabulously wealthy, ancient, and unnervingly alien power that ruled the sea from a vast, unfortified, and impossibly complex house. As the centuries of illiteracy and poverty passed, these oral traditions, these bardic tales, were the only threads that connected the new, iron-using world to the lost golden age of bronze. And in the telling and retelling, the threads of history became twisted, rewoven, and darkened into the vibrant, terrifying, and immortal fabric of myth. The historical reality was transformed, its elements isolated and exaggerated, its serene, natural grace replaced by a new, heroic, and dramatic narrative. The palace at Knossos, with its cellular, multi-storied, and bewildering plan, an architecture of such sophisticated confusion, a true labyrinth to the mainland mind, became the labyrinth, a singular, purposeful, and malevolent prison, a maze designed by a genius to hold a monster. The long, powerful, and anonymous line of Minoan rulers, a centralized authority perhaps known by a common title or a dynastic name, coalesced in the Greek imagination into one figure, King Minos, the powerful, sea-ruling son of Zeus and Europa, but also a king of tragic, dark, and cruel reputation. The sacred bull, the center of the Minoan ritual, the revered animal of the central court, was grotesquely transfigured. The Greeks, who did not share or understand the Minoan reverence for the beast, saw the constant, obsessive imagery of the bull and the stories of the palace and fused them. The bull became a monster, an unnatural creature, the offspring of Minos' queen and a divine bull, a hybrid terror with the body of a man and the head of a beast. They called it the Minotaur, the Bull of Minos, and they imagined it, living deep within the new, dark labyrinth, a creature of pure, unnatural hunger. The Minoan ritual of the bull leapers, those lithe, graceful, red and white figures who danced with death, was stripped of its acrobatic, religious grace and became a grim, human sacrifice. The tribute that Minoan Crete may have historically exacted from subject towns, perhaps even a fledgling Athens, was rewritten as the most terrible price of all. A tribute of 7 Athenian youths and 7 maidens sent into the labyrinth each year to be devoured by the monster. And finally, the sheer, almost magical skill of the Minoan artisan, the engineer who built the earthquake-proof walls, the artist who made the dolphins leap, the potter who spun the eggshell ware. This collective genius was personified. It was given a single name, Daedalus, the cunning craftsman, the mythical Athenian-born inventor who could make statues walk and who, in the Greek myth, was the architect hired by Minos to build the labyrinth. He was the one who, after being imprisoned, fashioned wings of wax and feathers to escape the very island he had helped to define. In this way, the real Minoans, the saffron gatherers, the snake goddesses, the linear A scribes, the peaceful merchants, were buried twice. First, they were buried by the ash of Thera and the fires of the Mycenaeans. And then they were buried again, more deeply, more permanently, by the power of Greek myth. Their memory was overwritten, their civilization recast as the dark, theatrical backdrop for the heroic deeds of a Greek hero, Theseus, who came to slay their monster and unravel their labyrinth. The true, complex, and serene light of Minoan Crete had been utterly forgotten, replaced by the flickering, dramatic torchlight of a monster's lair, its history sleeping, lost, and guarded for 3 millennia by the labyrinth of a story well told. The final fire at Knossos, the one that baked the last linear B tablets and broke the back of the Mycenaean occupation, at last grew cold. Its smoke, the final dark punctuation on a story of 3,000 years, thinned and vanished into the high, indifferent blue of the Cretan sky. And then, for the first time since the Neolithic farmers had laid their first huts upon that gentle hill, a profound and final silence fell. The labyrinth, the great complex breathing heart of the island, was still. There was no longer the sound of the scribe's stylus, no clatter of the chariot wheel, no whir of the potter's fast-spinning lathe. The central court, its paving stones cracked and blackened, was empty. It was no longer a stage for the bull leaper, no longer a gathering place for a community. It was just a void, open to the sky, its purpose forgotten, its meaning erased. The slow, patient, and inexorable work of the earth began. The wind, the true, eternal ruler of the island, blew down from the mountains, carrying dust and the small, winged seeds of wild grasses and the sharp, resilient thyme. They found purchase in the cracks of the gypsum floors, in the joints between the great, fallen ashlar blocks. The gentle, persistent rains of the mild winters began their work, dissolving the soft gypsum plaster of the frescoed walls. The leaping dolphins, the graceful, white-skinned ladies, the serene blue monkeys, their colors, which had been sealed in stone by the magic of buon fresco, now ran in slow, chalky rivulets, bleeding back into the soil, their forms blurring, fading, and finally vanishing into the mud. The great, inverted, blood-red cypress columns, which had been the proud signature mark of the palaces, began to rot. The moisture seeped into their deep wooden cores, their vibrant red paint flaking away, their substance softening until, one by one, they gave way. The massive, multi-ton limestone lintels they had supported for centuries groaned, shifted, and then fell, a cascade of stone that buried the chambers below. The grand staircases, with their luminous, shallow steps, were choked with debris, becoming mere jumbled ramps of broken rock. The light wells, those brilliant architectural lungs, were now just dark, rubble-filled shafts. The sunlight they had been built to capture no longer able to penetrate the deep, growing mound. The labyrinth was not just collapsing, it was inhaling the earth, filling its own corridors, burying its own secrets. On the hillsides, the other older ruins of Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, already cold for a century, continued their own slow return. The proud, dressed blocks of their facades toppled, their sharp, geometric edges worn down by the rain and the wind, until they began to resemble the natural, rocky outcroppings of the limestone landscape from which they had been quarried. The deep, stone-lined couloirs, the granaries of the old palaces, filled with water, then with silt, becoming small, marshy ponds, and then finally solid earth, their locations marked only by a circle of richer green. The island's red soil, the Terra Rosa, was a patient, hungry blanket, and it slowly, tenderly covered everything. The olive trees, the ancient, gnarled, silver-leafed souls of the Mediterranean, began their quiet reconquest. Their roots, slow and persistent, probed the darkness beneath the new soft mounds. They found the buried magazines, their thin, seeking tendrils slipping between the cracks of the fallen capstones, winding their way into the cool, subterranean dark. They found the great, shattered pithoi, the giant clay wombs that had once held the island's wealth, and they wrapped them in a fine wooden embrace, drawing nutrients from the rich, decomposed remains of the oil and wine that had spilled 3 millennia before, and the people they forgot. The complex and interwoven society of the palaces dissolved. The knowledge of the scripts, both A and B, vanished utterly. The flowing syllabic signs, baked hard on their clay tablets, were now just meaningless, geometric scratches, inert fragments of a language that had no voice, no speaker, no memory. The meaning of the horns of consecration, the power of the snake goddess, the ritual of the bull, all of it faded from human thought, surviving only as the dark, twisted, and monstrous fables of their mainland successors. For 3,000 years, the Minoans slept. Generations of shepherds, living in simple stone and mud huts, grazed their flocks of goats and sheep on the gentle, time-covered slopes of a hill they called Kephala, unaware that their feet trod upon the buried throne room of a king, upon the painted bodies of dolphins, upon the enigmatic faience smile of a goddess holding her serpents in the dark. The island lived on, battered by new histories. The Dorians came, then the Romans, their legions marching on roads built over the sleeping villas. The Byzantine chants echoed from new monasteries, and the winged lion of Venice built its high stone fortresses on the coasts. But beneath it all, the Minoan spirit waited, not dead, but held in suspension, its colors and its forms preserved in the dry, patient, and perfect darkness of the red earth. It waited for the turn of a new, inquisitive age, for the patient hand, and for the archaeologist's fine whispering brush that would in a different millennium finally gently pull back the heavy earthen shroud. And so we leave them there, in that deep, quiet, and timeless peace. The story, for now, is told. The palaces are asleep, the earth is still. The only sound is the wind in the olive trees, a soft, sighing breath over the hills. There is nothing more to see tonight. The past is safe, returned to the red soil, and all is quiet. Rest now